Chapter 18 of 25 Sermons on the Holy Land. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 25 Sermons on the Holy Land by Thomas DeWitt Talmage. He toucheth the hills, and they smoke. Psalm 104:32. David the poet here pictures a volcano, and what Church's Cotopaxi does on painter's canvas, this author does in words. You see a hill calm and still, and for ages immovable, but the Lord out of the heavens puts his finger on the top of it, and from it rise thick vapors intershot with fire. He toucheth the hills, and they smoke. God is the only being who can manage a volcano, and again he has employed volcanic action. The pictures on the walls of Pompeii, the exhumed Italian city, as we saw them last November, demonstrate that the city was not fit to live. In the 1st century, that city, engirded with palaces, emparadised with gardens, pillared into architectural exquisiteness, was at the foot of a mountain, up the sides of which it ran with vineyards and villas of merchant princes, and all that marble and bronze and imperial baths, and arboriculture, and rainbowed fountains, and a Colosseum at the dedication of which 9,000 beasts had been slain, and a supernal landscape in which the shore gave roses to the sea, and the sea gave crystals to the shore. Yes, all that beauty and pomp and wealth could give was there to be seen or heard. But the bad morals of the city had shocked the world. In the year 79, on the 4th of August, a black column rose above the adjoining mountain and spread out, Pliny says, as he saw it, like a great pine tree, wider and wider, until it began to rain upon the city, first thin ashes, and then pumice stone, and sulphurous fumes scooped, and streams of mud poured through the streets, till few people escaped, and the city was buried, and some of the inhabitants 1800 years after were found embalmed in the scoriae of that awful doom. The Lord called upon volcanic forces to obliterate that profligate city. He touched the hills, and they smoked. Nothing but volcanic action can explain what I shall show you at the Dead Sea, upon which I looked last December, and of whose waters I took a bitter and stinging taste. Concerning all that region there has been controversy enough to fill libraries, science saying one thing, revelation saying another thing. But admit volcanic action divinely employed, and both testimonies are one and the same. Geology, chemistry, geography, astronomy, ichthyology, ornithology, and zoology are coming one by one to confirm the Scriptures. 2 leaves of one book are revelation and creation, and the penmanship is by the same divine hand. Our horseback ride will not be so steep today, and you can stay on without clinging to the pommel of the saddle, but the scenes amid which we ride shall, if possible, be more thrilling, and by the time the horses snuff the sulphurous atmosphere of Lake Asphaltites, or the Dead Sea, we shall be ready to dismount and read from our Bibles about what was done that day by the Lord when he touched the hills and they smoked. Take a tour and pass along by the rocky fortress of Masada, where occurred something more wonderful in the day of desperation than you have ever heard of, unless you have heard of that. Herod built a palace amid these heaps of black and awful rocks which look like a tumbled midnight. A great band of robbers, about 1,000, including their families, afterward held the fortress. When the Roman army stormed that steep, and the bandits could no longer hold the place, their chieftain, Eleazar, made a powerful speech which persuaded them to die before they were captured. First the men kissed their families a loving and tearful goodbye, and then put a dagger into their hearts, and the women and the children were slain. Then 10 men were chosen by lot to slay all the other men, and each man lay down by the dead wife and children, and waited for these executioners to do their work. This done, 1 man of the 10 killed the other 9. Then the survivor committed suicide. 2 women and 5 children had hid themselves, and after all was over, came forth to tell of the 960 slaughtered. Great and rugged natural scenery makes the most tremendous natures for good or evil. Great statesmen and great robbers, great orators and great butchers, were nearly all born or reared among mountain precipices. Strong natures are hardly ever born upon the plain. When men have anything greatly good or greatly evil to do, they come down off the rocks. Pass on from under the shadow of Masada, the scene of concentrated diabolism, and come along where the salt crystals crackle under the horses' hooves. You are near the most God-forsaken region of all the earth. You to whom the word lake has heretofore suggested those bewitchments of beauty, lucerne or cayuga, some great pearl set by a loving God in the bosom of the luxuriant valley, change all your ideas about a lake, and see this sheet of water which the Bible calls the Salt Sea or Sea of the Plain, and Josephus calls Lake Asphaltites. The muleteers will take care of the horses while we get down to the brink and dip up the liquid mixture in the palm of the hand. The waters are a commingling of brimstone and pitch, and have 6 times larger percentage of salt than those of the Atlantic Ocean, the ocean having 4% of salt, and this lake 26¼ %. Lake Siri Kol of India is the highest lake in the world. This lake on the banks of which we kneel is the lowest lake. It empties into no sea, among other things, for the simple reason that water cannot run uphill. It swallows up the river Jordan, and makes no response of thanks, and never reports what it does with the 20 million cubic feet of water annually received from that sacred river. It takes the tree branches and logs floated into it by the Jordan, and pitches them on the banks of bitumen to decay there. The hot springs near its banks, by the name of Kalirho, where King Herod came to bathe off his illnesses, no sooner pour into the sea than they are poisoned. Not a fish scale swims it. Not an insect walks it. It hates life, and if you attempt to swim there, it lifts you by an unnatural buoyancy to the surface, as much as to say, we want no life here, but death is our preference, death. Those who attempt to wade into this lake and submerge themselves come out almost maddened, as with the sting of 100 wasps and hornets, and with lips and eyelids swollen with the strange ablution. The sparkle of its waters is not like the sparkle of beauty on other lakes, but a metallic luster like unto the flash of a sword that would thrust you. The gazelles and the ibexes that live on the hills beside it, and the cranes and wild ducks that fly across, for, contrary to the old belief, birds do safely wing their way over it, and the Arab horses you have been riding, though thirsty enough, will not drink out of this dreadful mixture. A mist hovers over parts of it almost continually, which, though natural evaporation, seems like a wing of doom spread over liquid desolation. It is the rinsings of abomination. It is an aqueous monster coiled among the hills, or creeping with ripples, and stenchful with nauseating malodors. In these regions once stood 4 great cities of Assyria, Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim. The Bible says they were destroyed by a tempest of fire and brimstone after these cities had filled up of wickedness. No, that is absurd, cries someone. It is evident that this was a region of salt and brimstone and pitch long before that. And so it was. The Bible says it was a region of sulphur long before the great catastrophe. Well now, says someone, wanting to raise a quarrel between science and revelation, you have no right to say the cities of the plain were destroyed by a tempest of fire and sulphur and brimstone, because this region had these characteristics long before these cities were destroyed. Volcanic action is my reply. These cities had been built out of very combustible materials. The mortar was of bitumen easily ignited, and the walls dripped with pitch most inflammable. They sat, I think, on a ridge of hills. They stood high up and conspicuous, radiant in their sins, ostentatious in their debaucheries, 4 hells on earth. One day there was a rumbling in the earth and a quaking. "What's that?" cry the affrighted inhabitants. "What's that?" The foundations of the earth were giving way. A volcano, whose fires had been burning for ages, at God's command burst forth, easily setting everything aflame, and first lifting these cities high in the air, and then dashing them down in chasms fathomless. The fires of that eruption intershot the dense smoke, and rolled unto the heavens, only to descend again. And all the configuration of that country was changed, and where there was a hill there came a valley, and where there had been the pomp of uncleanness came widespread desolation. The red-hot spade of volcanic action had shoveled under the cities of the plain. Before the catastrophe, the cities stood on the top of the salt and sulphur. After the catastrophe, they were under the salt and sulphur. Science right, revelation right. He toucheth the hills, and they smoke. No science ever frightened believers in revelation so much as geology. They feared that the strata of the earth would contradict the Scriptures, and then Moses must go under. But as in the Dead Sea instance, so in all cases God's writing on the earth and God's writing in the Bible are harmonious. The shelves of rock correspond with the shelves of the American Bible Society. Science digs into the earth and finds deep down the remains of plants, and so the Bible announces plants first. Science digs down and says, "Marine animals next," and the Bible says, "Marine animals next." Science digs down and says, "Land animals next," and the Bible responds, "Land animals next." "Then comes man," says science. "Then comes man," responds the Bible. Science digs into the regions about the Dead Sea and finds result of fire and masses of brimstone, and announces a wonderful geological formation. "Oh, yes," says the Bible. Moses wrote thousands of years ago, "The Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven." And David wrote, "He toucheth the hills, and they smoke." So I guess we will hold on to our Bibles a little longer. A gentleman in the ante-room of the White House, at Washington, having an appointment with Mr. Lincoln at 5 o'clock in the morning, got there 15 minutes early, and asked the servant, "Who is talking in the next room?" "It is the President, sir." "Is anybody with him?" "No, sir, he is reading the Bible. He spends every morning from 4 to 5 o'clock reading the Scriptures." My text implies that God controls volcanoes not with the full force of his hand, but with the tip of his finger. Etna, Stromboli, and Vesuvius fawn at his feet like hounds before the hunter. These eruptions of the hills do not belong to Pluto's realm, as the ancients thought, but to the divine dominions. Humboldt counted 200 of them, but since then the Indian archipelago has been found to have 900 of these great mouthpieces. They are on every continent and in all latitudes. That earthquake which shook all America about 6 or 7 summers ago was only the raving around of volcanoes rushing against the sides of their rocky caverns trying to break out. They must come to the surface, but it will be at the divine call. They seem reserved for the punishment of one kind of sin. The 7 cities they have obliterated were celebrated for one kind of transgression. Profligacy was the chief characteristic of the 7 cities over which they put their smothering wing. Pompeii, Herculaneum, Stabiae, Adma, Zeboim, Sodom, and Gomorrah. If our American cities do not quit their profligacy, if in high and low life dissoluteness does not cease to be a joke and become a crime, if wealthy libertinism continues to find so many doors of domestic life open to its faintest touch, if Russian and French and American literature, steeped in pruriency, does not get banished from the newsstands and ladies' parlors, God will let loose some of these suppressed monsters of the earth. And I tell these American cities that it will be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment, whether that day of judgment be in this present century or in the closing century of the earth's continuance. The volcanic forces are already in existence, but in the mercy of God they are chained in the kennels of subterraneous fires. Yet let profligacy, whether it stagger into a lazaretto or sit on a commercial throne, whether it laugh in a faded shawl under the street gaslight, or be wrapped in the finest array that foreign loom ever wrought or lapidary ever impearled, know right well that there is a volcano waiting for it, whether in domestic life or social life or political life, or in the foundations of the earth from which sprang out the devastations that swallowed the cities of the plain. He toucheth the hills, and they smoke. But the dragoman was rejoiced when we had seen enough of this volcanic region of Palestine, and he gladly tightens the girths for another march around the horses, which are prancing and neighing for departure. We are off for the Jordan, only 2 hours away. We pass Bedouins whose stern features melt into a smile as we give them the salutation, Salam alaikum, peace be with you, their smile sometimes leaving us in doubt as to whether it is caused by their gladness to see us or by our poor pronunciation of the Arabic. Oh, they are a strange race, these Bedouins. Such a commingling of ruffianism and honor, of cowardice and courage, of cruelty and kindness. When a band of them came down upon a party in which Miss Whately was traveling, and were about to take pocketbooks and perhaps life, this lady sitting upon her horse took out her notebook and pencil and began to sketch these brigands, and seeing this composure, the bandits thought it something supernatural and fled. Christian womanliness or manliness is all-conquering. When Martin Luther was told that Duke George would kill him if he went to Leipzig, Luther replied, "I would go to Leipzig if it rained Duke Georges 9 days." Now we come through regions where there are hills cut into the shape of cathedrals, with altar and column and arch and chancel and pulpit and dome, and architecture of the rocks that I think can hardly just happen so. Perhaps it is because God loves the church so well, he builds in the solitudes of Yellowstone Park and Yosemite and Switzerland and Palestine these ecclesiastical piles. And who knows but that unseen spirits may sometimes worship there? "Dragoman, when shall we see the Jordan?" I asked. All the time we were on the alert, and looking through tamarisk and willows for the greatest river of all earth. The Mississippi is wider, the Ohio is deeper, the Amazon is longer, and the Hudson rolls amid regions more picturesque, the Thames has more splendor on its banks, the Tiber suggests more imperial procession, the Ilyssus has more classic memories, and the Nile feeds greater populations by its irrigation. But the Jordan is the queen of rivers and runs through all the Bible, a silver thread strung like beads with heroics, and before night we shall meet on its banks Elijah and Elisha, and David and Jacob and Joshua, and John and Jesus. At last, between 2 trees I got a glimpse of a river, and said, "What is that?" "The Jordan," was the quick reply. And all along the line which had been lengthened by other pilgrims, some from America and some from Europe and some from Asia, the cry was sounded, "The Jordan! The Jordan!" Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims have chanted on its banks and bathed in its waters. Many of them dip a gown in the wave, and wring it out, and carry it home for their own shroud. It is an impetuous stream, and rushes on as though it were hastening to tell its story to the ages. Many an explorer has it whelmed, and many a boat has it wrecked. Lieutenant Molyneux had copper-bottomed crafts split upon its shelvings. Only one boat, that of Lieutenant Lynch, ever lived to sail the whole length of it. At the season when the snows on Lebanon melt, the rage of this stream is like the Conemaugh when Johnstown perished, and the wild beasts that may be near run for the hills, explaining what Jeremiah says, "Behold, he shall go up like a lion from the swelling of Jordan." No river so often changes its mind, for it turns and twists, traveling 200 miles to do that which in a straight line might be done in 60 miles. Among banks now low, now high, now of rocks, now of mud, and now of sand, laving the feet of the terebinths and oleanders, and acacias, and reeds, and pistachios, and silver poplars. This river marries the Dead Sea to Lake Galilee, and did ever so rough a groom take the hand of so fair a bride. This is the river which parted to let an army of 2,000,000 Israelites cross. Here the skilled major general of the Syrian host at the 7th plunge dropped his leprosy, not only by miraculous cure, but suggesting to all ages that water, and plenty of it, had much to do with the sanitary improvement of the world. Here is where some theological students of Elisha's time were cutting trees with which to build a theological seminary, and an axe head, not sufficiently wedged to the handle, flew off into the river and sank, and the young man deplored not so much the loss of the axe head as the fact that it was not his own, and cried, "Alas, it was borrowed!" And the prophet threw a stick into the river, and, in defiance of the law of gravitation, the iron axe-head came to the surface and floated like a cork upon the water, and kept floating until the young man caught it. A miracle performed to give one an opportunity to return that which was borrowed, and a rebuke in all ages for those who borrow and never return, their bad habit in this respect so established that it would be a miracle if they did return it. Yea, from the bank of this river Elijah took team of fire, showing that the most raging element is servant of the good, and that there is no need that a child of God fear anything. For, if the most destructive of all elements was that day fashioned into a vehicle for a departing saint, nothing can ever hurt you who love and trust the Lord. I am so glad that that chariot of Elijah was not made out of wood, or crystal, or anything ordinarily pleasant, but out of fire, and yet he went up without having so much as to fan himself. When, stepping from amid the foliage of these oleanders and tamarisks on the banks of the Jordan, he put his foot on the red step of the red equipage, and took the red reins of vapor in his hands, and spurred the galloping steed toward the wide-open gate of heaven, it was a scene forever memorable. So the hottest afflictions of your life may roll you heavenward. So the most burning persecutions, the most fiery troubles, may become uplifting. Only be sure that when you pull on the bits of fire, you drive up toward God, and not down towards the Red Sea. When Latimer and Ridley died at the stake, they went up in a chariot of fire. When my friend P. Bliss, the gospel singer, was consumed with the rail train that broke through Ashtabula Bridge, and then took flame, I said, "Another Elijah gone up in a chariot of fire." But this river is a river of baptisms. Christ was here baptized, and John baptized many thousands. Whether on these occasions the candidate for baptism and the officer of religion went into this river, and then, while both were standing, the water was dipped in the hand of one and sprinkled upon the forehead of the other, or whether the entire form of the one baptized disappeared for a moment beneath the surface of the flood, I do not now declare. While I cannot think without deep emotion of the fact that my parents held me in infancy to the baptismal font in the old meeting-house at Somerville, and assumed vows on my behalf, I must tell you now of another mode of baptism observed in the river Jordan, on that afternoon in last December, the particulars of which I now for the first time relate. It was a scene of unimaginable solemnity. A comrade in our Holy Land journey rode up by my side that day, and told me that a young man, who is now studying for the gospel ministry, would like to be baptized by me in the river Jordan. I got all the facts I could concerning his earnestness and faith, and through personal examination made myself confident he was a worthy candidate. There were among our Arab attendants 2 robes not unlike those used for American baptistries, and these we obtained. As we were to have a large group of different nationalities present, I dictated to my daughter a few verses, and had copies enough made to allow all to sing. Our dragoman had a man familiar with the river wade through and across to show the depth and the swiftness of the stream and the most appropriate place for the ceremony. Then I read from the Bible the accounts of baptisms in that sacred stream, and implored the presence of the Christ on whose head the dove descended at the Jordan. Then, as the candidate and myself stepped into the waters, the people on the banks sang in full and resounding voice, "On Jordan's stormy banks I stand, and cast a wistful eye to Canaan's fair and happy land, where my possessions lie." Oh, the transporting, rapturous scene that rises to my sight, sweet fields arrayed in living green, and rivers of delight. By this time we had reached the middle of the river. As the candidate sank under the floods and rose again under a baptism in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost, there rushed through our souls a tide of holy emotion, such as we shall not probably feel again until we step into the Jordan that divides earth from heaven. Will those waters be deep? Will those tides be strong? No matter if Jesus steps in with us. Friends on this shore to help us off. Friends on the other shore to help us land. See, they are coming down the hills on the other side to greet us. How well we know their step. How easily we distinguish their voices. From bank to bank we hail them with tears, and they hail us with palm branches. They say to us, "Is that you, Father? Is that you, Mother?" And we answer by asking, "Is that you, my darling?" How near they seem, and how narrow the stream that divides us. Could we but stand where Moses stood and view the landscape o'er, not Jordan's stream nor death's cold flood could fright us from the shore. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of 25 Sermons on the Holy Land. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 25 Sermons on the Holy Land by DeWitt Talmage. Solomon in all his glory. I made me great works. I builded me houses. I planted me vineyards. I made me gardens and orchards, and planted trees in them of all kinds of fruits. I made me pools of water, to water therewith the wood that bringeth forth trees. Book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 2, verses 4 to 6. A spring morning, and before breakfast at Jerusalem, a king with robes snowy white, in chariot decked with gold, drawn by 8 horses, high-mettled, and housings as brilliant as if scalloped out of the very sunrise, and like the winds for speed, followed by a regiment of archers on horseback, with hand on gilded bow, and arrows with steel points flashing in the sun, clad from head to foot in Tyrian purple, and black hair sprinkled with gold dust, all dashing down the road, the horses at full run, the reins loose on their necks, and the crack of whips, and the halloo of the reckless cavalcade putting the miles at defiance. Who is it, and what is it? King Solomon, taking an outing before breakfast, from Jerusalem to his gardens, and parks, and orchards, and reservoirs, 6 miles down the road towards Hebron. What a contrast between that and myself on that very road one morning last December, going afoot for our plain vehicle turned back for photographic apparatus forgotten. We on the way to find what is called Solomon's Pools, the ancient waterworks of Jerusalem, and the gardens of a king nearly 3,000 years ago. We cross the aqueduct again and again, and here we are at the three great reservoirs. Not ruins of reservoirs, but the reservoirs themselves that Solomon built 3 millenniums ago for the purpose of catching the mountain streams and passing them to Jerusalem to slake the thirst of the city, and also to irrigate the most glorious range of gardens that ever bloomed with all colours or breathed with all redolence. For Solomon was the greatest horticulturalist, the greatest botanist, the greatest ornithologist, the greatest capitalist, the greatest scientist of his century. Come over the piles of grey rock, and here we are at the first of the 3 reservoirs, which are on 3 great levels, the base of the top reservoir higher than the top of the second, the base of the second reservoir higher than the top of the third, so arranged that the waters gathered from several sources above shall descend from basin to basin, the sediment of the water deposited in each of the 3, so that by the time it gets down to the aqueduct which is to take it to Jerusalem, it has had 3 filterings, and is as pure as when the clouds rained it. Wonderful specimens of masonry are these 3 reservoirs. The white cement fastening the blocks of stone together is now just as when the trowels 3,000 years ago smoothed the layers. The highest reservoir, 380 feet by 229, the second, 423 feet by 160, and the lowest reservoir, 589 feet by 169, and deep enough and wide enough and mighty enough to float an ocean steamer. On that December morning we saw the waters rolling down from reservoir to reservoir, and can well understand how in this neighbourhood the imperial gardens were one great blossom, and the orchard one great basket of fruit, and that Solomon in his palace, writing the Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes, may have been drawing illustrations from what he had seen that very morning in the royal gardens, when he alluded to melons and mandrakes and apricots and grapes, and pomegranates and figs and spikenard and cinnamon, and calamus and camphire, and apple trees among the trees of the wood, and the almond tree as flourishing, and the myrrh and frankincense, and represented Christ as gone down into his gardens, and the beds of spices to feed in the gardens and to gather lilies, and to eyes like fishpools, and to the voice of the turtle dove as heard in the land. I think it was when Solomon was showing the Queen of Sheba through these gardens that the Bible says of her, "There remained no more spirit in her. She gave it up." But all this splendour did not make Solomon happy. One day, after getting back from his morning ride, and before the horses had yet been cooled off and rubbed down by the royal equerry, Solomon wrote the memorable words following my text, like a dirge played after a grand march. "Behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun." In other words, it don't pay. Would God that we might all learn the lesson that this world cannot produce happiness. At Marseille there is a castellated house on high ground, crowned with all that grove and garden can do, and the whole place looks out upon as enchanting a landscape as the world holds, water and hill clasping hands in a perfect bewitchment of scenery. But the owner of that place is totally blind, and to him all this goes for nothing, illustrating the truth that, whether one be physically or morally blind, brilliancy of surrounding cannot give satisfaction. But tradition says that when the wise men of the East were being guided by the star on the way to Bethlehem, they, for a little while, lost sight of that star, and in desperation and exhaustion came to a well to drink, when, looking down into the well, they saw the star reflected in the water, and that cheered them, and they resumed their journey. And I have the notion that though grandeur and pomp of surroundings may not afford peace, at the well of God's consolation, close by, you may find happiness, and the plainest cup at the well of salvation may hold the brightest star that ever shone from the heavens. Although these Solomonic gardens are in ruins, there are now growing there flowers that are to be found nowhere else in the Holy Land. How do I account for that? Solomon sent out his ships and robbed the gardens of the whole earth for flowers and planted these exotics here, and these particular flowers are direct descendants of the foreign plants he imported. Mr. Meshullam, a Christian Israelite, on the very site of these royal gardens, has, in our day, by putting in his own spade, demonstrated that the ground is only waiting for the right call to yield just as much luxuriance and splendour 1800 years after Christ as it yielded Solomon 1000 years before Christ. So all Palestine is waiting to become the richest scene of horticulture, arboriculture, and agriculture. Recent travellers in the Holy Land speak of the rocky and stony surface of nearly all Palestine as an impassable barrier to the future cultivation of the soil. But if they had examined minutely the rocks and stones of the Holy Land, they would find that they are being skeletonized and are being melted into the soil, and, being for the most part limestone, they are doing for that land what the American and English farmer does when, at great expense and fatigue, he draws his wagon load of lime and scatters it on the fields for their enrichment. The storms, the winters, the great midsummer heats of Palestine, by crumbling up and dissolving the rocks, are gradually preparing Palestine and Syria to yield a product like unto the luxuriant Westchester farms of New York, and Lancaster County farms of Pennsylvania, and Somerset County farms of New Jersey, and the other magnificent farm fields of Minnesota and Wisconsin, and the opulent orchards of Maryland and California. Let the Turk be driven out, and the American or Englishman or Scotchman go in, and Mohammedanism withdraw its idolatries, and pure Christianity build its altars, and the irrigation of which Solomon's pools was only a suggestion will make all that land from Dan to Beersheba as fertile and aromatic and resplendent as on the morning when the king rode out to his pleasure grounds, in chariots so swift, and followed by mounted riders so brilliant that it was for speed like a hurricane followed by a cyclone. As I look upon this great aqueduct of Palestine, a wondrous specimen of ancient masonry, about 7 feet high, 2 feet wide, sometimes tunnelling the solid rock and then rolling its waters through stoneware pipes, an aqueduct doing its work 10 miles before it gets to those 3 reservoirs, and then gathering their wealth of refreshment and pouring it on to the mighty city of Jerusalem, and filling the brazen sea of her temple, and the bathrooms of her palaces, and the great pools of Siloam, and Hezekiah, and Bethesda, I find that our century has no monopoly on the world's wonders, and that the conceited age in which we live had better take in some of the sails of its pride when it remembers that it is hard work in later ages to get masonry that will last 50 years, to say nothing of the 3,000, and no modern machinery could lift blocks of stone like some of those standing high up in the walls of Baalbek, and that the art of printing claimed for recent ages was practiced by the Chinese 1400 years ago, and that our midnight lightning express rail train was foreseen by the prophet Nahum, when in the Bible he wrote, "The chariots shall rage in the streets, they shall jostle one against another in the broad ways, they shall seem like torches, they shall run like the lightnings." And our electric telegraph was foreseen by Job, when in the Bible he wrote, "Canst thou send lightnings that they may go and say unto thee, Here we are?" What is talking by the lightnings but the electric telegraph? I do not know but that the electric forces now being year by year more thoroughly harnessed may have been employed in ages extinct, and that the lightnings all up and down the skies have been running around like lost hounds to find their former master. Embalmment was a more thorough art 3,000 years ago than today. Dentistry, that we suppose one of the important arts discovered in recent centuries, is proven to be 4,000 years old by the filled teeth of the mummies in the museums at Cairo, Egypt, and artificial teeth on gold plates found by Belzoni in the tombs of departed nations. We have been taught that Harvey discovered the circulation of the blood so late as the 17th century. Oh no, Solomon announces it in Ecclesiastes, where first having shown that he understood the spinal cord, silver-coloured as it is, that it relaxes in old age, in "the silver cord be loosed," goes on to compare the heart to a pitcher at a well, for the 3 canals of the heart do receive the blood like a pitcher. Quote, "Or the pitcher be broken at the fountain." What is it but the circulation of the blood, found out 2,600 years before Harvey was born? What is that but the circulation of the blood, found out 2,600 years before Harvey was born? After many centuries of exploration and calculation, astronomy finds out that the world is round. Why, Isaiah knew it was round thousands of years before, when in the Bible he said, "The Lord sitteth upon the circle of the earth." Scientists toiled on for centuries and found out refraction, or that the rays of light when touching the earth were not straight but bent or curved. Why, Job knew that, when ages before in the Bible he wrote of the light, "It is turned as clay to the seal." In the old cathedrals of England, modern painters, in the repair of windows, are trying to make something as good as the window painting of 400 years ago, and always failing by the unanimous verdict of all who examine and compare. The colour of modern painting fades in 50 years, while the colour of the old masters is well preserved after 500 years as after 1 year. I saw last winter on the walls of exhumed Pompeii paintings with colour as fresh as though made the day before, though they were buried 1,800 years ago. The making of Tyrian purple is an impossibility now. In our modern potteries we are trying hard to make cups and pitchers and bowls as exquisite as those exhumed from Herculaneum, and our artificers are attempting to make jewellery for ear and neck and finger equal to that brought up from the mausoleums of 2,000 years before Christ. We have in our time glass in all shapes and colours, but Pliny, more than 1800 years ago, described a malleable glass which, if thrown upon the ground and dented, could be pounded straight again by the hammer, or could be twisted around the wrists, and that confounds all the glass manufacturers of our own time. I tried in Damascus, Syria, to buy a Damascus blade, one of those swords that could be bent double or tied into a knot without breaking. I could not get one. Why? The 19th century cannot make a Damascus blade. If we go on enlarging our cities, we may after a while get a city as large as Babylon, which was 5 times the size of London. The aqueducts of Solomon that I visit today, finding them in good condition 3,000 years after construction, make me think that the world may have forgotten more than it now knows. The great honour of our age is not machinery, for the ancients had some styles of it more wonderful, nor art, for the ancients had art more exquisite and durable, nor architecture, for Roman Colosseum and Grecian Acropolis surpass all modern architecture, nor cities, for some of the ancient cities were larger than ours in the sweep of their pomp, but our attempts must be in moral achievement and gospel victory. In that we have already surpassed them, and in that direction let the ages push on. Let us brag less of worldly achievement and thank God for moral opportunity. More good men and good women is what the world wants. Toward moral elevation and spiritual attainment let the chief struggle be. The source of all that I will show you before sundown of this day on which we have visited the pools of Solomon and the gardens of the king. We are on this December afternoon on the way to the cradle of him who called himself greater than Solomon. We are coming upon the chief cradle of all the world, not lined with satin but strewn with straw, not sheltered by a palace but covered by a barn, not presided over by a princess but hovered over by a peasant girl, yet the cradle of the canopy of which is angelic wings, and the lullaby of which is the first Christmas carol ever sung, and from which all the events of the past and all the events of the future have and must take date as being BC or AD, before Christ or after Christ. All eternity past occupied in getting ready for this cradle, and all eternity to come to be employed in celebrating its consequences. I said to the tourist companies planning our Oriental journey, put us in Bethlehem in December, the place and month of our Lord's birth. And we had our wish. I am the only man who ever attempted to tell how Bethlehem looked at the season Jesus was born. Tourists and writers are there in February or March or April, when the valleys are an embroidered sheet of wild flowers and anemones, and ranunculus are flushed as though from attempting to climb the steeps, and lark and bullfinch are flooding the air with a bird orchestra. But I was there in December, a winter month, the barren beach between the 2 oceans of redolence. I was told I must not go there at that season, told so before I started, told so in Egypt, the books told me so. All travellers that I consulted about it told me so also. But I was determined to see Bethlehem the same month in which Jesus arrived, and nothing could dissuade me. Was I not right in wanting to know how the Holy Land looked when Jesus came to it? He did not land amid flowers and song. When the angels chanted on the famous birth night, all the fields of Palestine were silent. The glowing skies were answered by grey rocks. As Bethlehem stood against a bleak wintry sky, Jesus descended upon it. His way down was from warmth to chill, from bloom to barrenness, from everlasting June to a sterile December. If I were going to Palestine as a botanist, and to study the flora of the land, I would go in March, but I went as a minister of Christ to study Jesus, and so I went in December. I wanted to see how the world's front door looked when the heavenly stranger entered it. The town of Bethlehem, to my surprise, is in the shape of a horseshoe, the houses extending clear onto the prongs of the horseshoe. The whole scene more rough and rude than can be imagined. Verily, Christ did not choose a soft, genial place in which to be born. The gate through which our Lord entered this world was a gate of rock, a hard, cold gate, and the gate through which he departed was a swinging gate of sharpened spears. We enter a gloomy church built by Constantine over the place in which Jesus was born. 15 lamps burning day and night, and from century to century, light our way to the spot which all authorities, Christian and Jew and Mohammedan, agree upon as being the place of our Saviour's birth, and covered by a marble slab, marked by a silver star sent from Vienna, and the words, "Here Jesus Christ was born of the Virgin Mary." But standing there, I thought, though this is the place of the Nativity, how different the surroundings of the wintry night in which Jesus came. At that time it was a khan or a cattle pen. I visited one of these khans, now standing and looking just as in Christ's time. We rode in under the arched entrance and dismounted. We found the building of stone and around an open square without roof. The building is more than 2,000 years old. It is 2 stories high. In the centre are camels, horses and mules. Caravans halt here for the night or during a long storm. The open square is large enough to accommodate a whole herd of cattle, a flock of sheep, or caravan of camels. The neighbouring Bedouins here find market for their hay, straw and meats. Off from this centre there are 12 rooms for human habitation. The only light is from the door. I went into one of these rooms and found a woman cooking the evening meal. There were 6 cows in the same room. On a little elevation there was some straw where the people sat and slept where they wished to rest. It was in a room similar to that our Lord was born. This was the cradle of a king, and yet what cradle ever held so much? Civilization, liberty, redemption, your pardon and mine, your peace and mine, your heaven and mine. Cradle of a universe, cradle of a god. The gardens of Solomon we visited this morning were only a type of what all the world will be when this illustrious personage now born shall have completed his mission. The horse of finest limb and gayest champ of bit and sublimest arch of neck that ever brought Solomon down to these adjoining gardens was but a poor type of the horse upon which this conqueror born in the barn shall ride, when, according to apocalyptic vision, all the armies of heaven shall follow him on white horses. The waters that rush down these hills into yonder 3 great reservoirs of rock, and then pour in marvellous aqueduct into Jerusalem till the brazen sea is full, and the baths are full, and Siloam is full, are only an imperfect type of the rivers of delight which, as the result of this great one's coming, shall roll on for the slaking of the thirst of all nations. The palace of Lebanon cedar, from which the imperial cavalcade passed out in the early morning, and to which it returned with glowing cheek and jingling harness and lathered sides, is feeble of architecture compared with the house of many mansions, into which this one, born this winter month on these bleak heights, shall conduct us when our sins are all pardoned, our battles all fought, our tears all wept, our work all done. Standing here at Bethlehem, do you not see that the most honoured thing in all the earth is the cradle? To what else did lucent star ever point? To what else did heaven lower balconies of light filled with chanting immortals? The way the cradle rocks, the world rocks. God bless mothers all the world over. The cradles decide the destinies of nations. In 10,000 of them are, this moment, the hands that will yet give benediction of mercy or hurl bolts of doom, the feet that will mount the steps towards God or descend the blasted way, the lips that will pray or blaspheme. Oh, the cradle is more tremendous than the grave. Where are most of the leaders of the 20th century soon to dawn upon us? Are they on thrones? No. In chariots? No. In pulpits? No. In forums? No. In senatorial halls? No. In counting houses? No. They are in the cradle. The most tremendous thing in the universe, and, next to God, is to be a mother. Lord Shaftesbury said, "Give me a generation of Christian mothers, and I will change the whole phase of society in 12 months. Oh, the cradle! Forget not the one in which you were rocked. Though old and worn out, that cradle may be standing in attic or barn. Forget not the foot that swayed it, the lips that sang over it, the tears that dropped upon it, the faith in God that made way for it." The boy Walter Scott did well when he had spent the first 5-guinea piece he ever earned as a present to his mother. Dishonour not the cradle, though it may, like the one my sermon celebrates, have been a cradle in a barn, for I think it was a Christian cradle. That was a great cradle in which Martin Luther lay, for from it came forth the Reformation of the 16th century. That was a great cradle in which Daniel O'Connell lay, for from it came forth an eloquence that will be inspiring while men have eyes to read or ears to hear. That was a great cradle in which Washington lay, for from it came forth the happy deliverance of a nation. That was a great cradle in which John Howard lay, for from it came forth the mercy that will not cease until the last dungeon gets the Bible and light and fresh air. Great cradles in which the John Wesleys and the John Knoxes and John Masons lay, for from them came forth an all-conquering evangelization. But the greatest cradle in which child ever slept, or woke, or laughed, or cried, was the cradle over which Mary bent, and to which the wise men brought frankincense, and upon which the heavens dropped song. Had there been no manger, there had been no cross. Had there been no Bethlehem, there had been no Golgotha. Had there been no incarnation, there had been no ascension. Had there been no start, there had been no close. Standing in the chill calm of a Saviour's humiliation, and seeing what he did for us, I ask, what have we done for him? There is nothing I can do, says one. As Christmas was approaching the village church, a good woman said to a group of girls in lowly and straitened circumstances, "Let all now do something for Christ." After the day was over, she asked the group to tell her what they had done. One said, "I could not do much, for we are very poor, but I had a beautiful flower I had carefully trained in our home, and I thought much of it, and I put the flower on the church altar." And another said, "I could not do much, for we are very poor, but I can sing a little, and so I went down to a poor sick woman in the lane and sang as well as I could to cheer her up, a Christmas song. Well, Helen, what did you do? She replied, I could not do much, but I wanted to do something for Christ, and I could think of nothing else to do, and so I went into the church after the people who had been adorning the altar had left, and I scrubbed down the back altar stairs. Beautiful. I warrant that the Christ of that Christmas day gave her as much credit for that earnest act as he may have given the robed official who, on that day, read for the people the prayers of a resounding service. Something for Christ. Something for Christ. A plain man, passing a fortress, saw a Russian soldier on guard in a terribly cold night, and took off his coat and gave it to the soldier, saying, I will soon be home and warm, and you will be out here all night. So the soldier wrapped himself in the borrowed coat. The plain man who loaned the coat to the soldier soon after was dying, and in his dream saw Christ, and said to him, You've got my coat on. Yes, said Christ, this is the one you lent me on that cold night by the fortress. I was naked, and ye clothed me. Something for Christ. By the memories of Bethlehem, I adjure you. In the light of that star lie the ages impearled. That song from afar has swept over the world. End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of 25 Sermons on the Holy Land. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendrie. 25 Sermons on the Holy Land by DeWitt Talmage. The Journey to Bethel. So I lifted up mine eyes the way toward the north. Ezekiel chapter 8 verse 5. At 1 o'clock on a December afternoon, through Damascus gate we are passing out of Jerusalem for a journey northward. Ho, for Bethel with its stairs, the bottom step of which was a stone pillow, and Jacob's well with its immortal colloquy, and Nazareth with its divine boy in his father's carpenter shop, and the most glorious lake that ever rippled or flashed. Blue Galilee, sweet Galilee, the lake where Jesus loved to be. And Damascus with its crooked street called Straight, and 100 places charged and surcharged with apostolic, evangelistic, prophetic, patriarchal, kingly, and Christly reminiscences. In travelling along the roads of Palestine, I am impressed, as I could not otherwise have been, with the fact that Christ, for the most part, went afoot. We find him occasionally on a boat, and once riding in a triumphal procession, as it is sometimes called, although it seems to me that the hosannas of the crowd could not have made a ride on a stubborn, unimpressive, and funny creature, like that which pattered with him into Jerusalem, very much of a triumph. But we are made to understand that generally he walked. How much that means, only those know who have gone over the distance traversed by Christ. We are accustomed to read that Bethany is 2 miles from Jerusalem. Well, any man in ordinary health can walk 2 miles without fatigue, but not more than 1 man out of 1,000 can walk from Bethany to Jerusalem without exhaustion. It is over the Mount of Olives, and you must climb up among the rolling stones, and descend where exertion is necessary to keep you from falling prostrate. I, who am accustomed to walk 15 or 20 miles without lassitude, tried part of this road over the Mount of Olives, and confess I would not want to try it often, such demand does it make upon one's physical energies. Yet Christ walked it twice a day, in the morning from Bethany to Jerusalem, and in the evening from Jerusalem to Bethany. Likewise it seemed a small thing that Christ walked from Jerusalem to Nazareth, but it will take us 4 days of hard horseback riding, sometimes on a trot and sometimes on a gallop, to do it this week. The way is mountainous in the extreme. To those who went up to the Tip-Top House on Mount Washington before the railroad was laid, I will say that this journey from Jerusalem to Nazareth is like 7 such American journeys. So, all up and down and across and recrossing Palestine, Jesus walked. Ahab rode, David rode, Solomon rode, Herod rode, Antony rode, but Jesus walked. With swollen ankles and sore muscles of the legs, and bruised heel, and stiff joints, and panting lungs, and faint head, along the roads, and where there were no roads at all, Jesus walked. We tried to get a new horse other than that on which we had ridden on the journey to the Dead Sea, for he had faults, which our close acquaintance had developed. But after some experimenting with other quadrupeds of that species, and finding that all horses, like their riders, have faults, we concluded to choose a saddle on that beast whose faults we were most prepared to pity or resist. We rode down through the valley and then up on Mount Scopus, and as our dragoman tells us that this is the last opportunity we shall have of looking at Jerusalem, we turn our horse's head towards the city and take a long, sad, and thrilling look at the religious capital of our planet. This is the most impressive view of the most tremendous city of all time. On and around this hill, the armies of the Crusaders, at the first sight of the city, threw themselves on their faces in worship. Here most of the besieged armies encamped the night before opening their volleys of death against Jerusalem. Our last look. Farewell, Mount Zion, Mount Moriah, Mount of Olives, Mount Calvary. Will we never see them again? Never. The world is so large, and time is so short, and there are so many things we have never seen at all, that we cannot afford to duplicate visits or see anything more than once. Farewell yonder thrones of grey rock, and the 3,000 years of architecture and battlefields. Farewell sacred, sanguinary, triumphant, humiliated Jerusalem. Across this valley of the Kedron, with my right hand I throw thee a kiss of valedictory. Our last look, like our first look, an agitation of body, mind, and soul, indescribable. And now, like Ezekiel in my text, I lift up mine eyes the way toward the north. Near here was one of the worst tragedies of the ages mentioned in the Bible. An hospitable old man, coming home at eventide from his work in the fields, finds two strangers, a husband and wife, proposing to lodge in the streets, because no shelter is offered them, and invites them to come in and spend the night in his home. During the night, the ruffians of the neighbourhood conspired together and surrounded the house and left the woman dead on the doorstep, and the husband, to rally in revenge the 12 tribes, cut the corpse of the woman into 12 parts, and sent a 12th of it to each tribe. And the fury of the nation was roused, and a peremptory demand was made for the surrender of the assassins. And the demand refused. In one day 20,000 people were left dead on the field, and the next day 18,000. Wherever our horse plants his foot, in those ancient times a corpse lay, and the roads were crossed by red rivulets of carnage. Now we pass on where 7 youths were put to death and their bodies gibbeted or hung in chains, not for anything they had themselves done, but as a reparation for what their father and grandfather Saul had done. Burial was denied these youths from May until November. Rizpah, the mother of 2 of these dead boys, appoints herself as sentinel to guard the 7 corpses from beak of raven and tooth of wolf and paw of lion. She pitches a black tent on the rock close by the gibbets. Rizpah by day sits on the ground in front of her tent, and when a vulture begins to lower out of the noonday sky, seeking its prey among the gibbets, Rizpah rises, her long hair flying in the wind, and swinging her arms wildly about, shoos away the bird of prey until it retreats to its eyrie. At night she rests under the shadow of her tent, and sometimes falls into a drowsiness or half-sleep. But the step of a jackal among the dry leaves, or the panting of a hyena, arouses her, and with the fury of a maniac, she rushes out upon the rock, crying, "Away! Away!" and then, examining the gibbet to see that they still keep their burden, returns again to her tent, till some swooping wing from the midnight sky, or some growling monster on the rock, again wakes her. A mother watching her dead children through May, June, July, August, September, and October. What a vigil! Painters have tried to put upon canvas the scene, and they succeeded in sketching the hawks in the sky and the panthers crawling out from the jungle. But they fail to give the wanness, the earnestness, the supernatural courage, the infinite self-sacrifice of Rizpah the mother. A mother in the quiet home watching by the casket of a dead child for one night exerts the artist to his utmost. But who is sufficient to put upon canvas a mother for 6 months of midnights, guarding her whole family dead and gibbeted upon the mountains? Go home, Rizpah. You must be awfully tired. You are sacrificing your reason and your life for those whom you can never bring back again to your bosom. As I say that, from the darkest midnight of the century, Rizpah turns upon me and cries, "How dare you tell me to go home? I am a mother. I am not tired. You might as well expect God to get tired as for a mother to get tired. I cared for those boys when they lay upon my breast in infancy, and I will not forsake them now that they are dead. Interrupt me not. There stoops an eagle that I must drive back with my agonized cry. There is a panther I must beat back with my club." Do you know what that scene by our roadside in Palestine makes me think of? It is no unusual scene. Right here in these 3 cities by the American sea coast, there are 1,000 cases this moment worse than that. Mothers watching boys that the rum saloon, that annex of hell, has gibbeted in a living death. Boys hung in chains of evil habit they cannot break. The father may go to sleep after waiting until 12 o'clock at night for the ruined boy to come home, and giving it up he may say, "Mother, come to bed. There's no use sitting up any longer." But mother will not go to bed. It is 1 o'clock in the morning. It is 1:30. It is 2 o'clock. It is 2:30 when he comes staggering through the hall. Do you say that young man is yet alive? No, he is dead. Dead to his father's entreaties, dead to his mother's prayers, dead to the family altar where he was reared, dead to all the noble ambitions that once inspired him. Twice dead, only a corpse of what he once was, gibbeted before God and man and angels and devils, chained in a death that will not loosen its cold grasp. His father is asleep, his brothers are asleep, his sisters are asleep, but his mother is watching him in the night. After he has gone up to bed and fallen into a drunken sleep, his mother will go up to his room and see that he is properly covered, and before she turns out the light, will put a kiss upon his bloated lips. "Mother, why don't you go to bed?" "Ah," she says, "I cannot go to bed. I am Rizpah watching the slain." And what are the political parties of this country doing for such cases? They are taking care not to hurt the feelings of the jackals and the buzzards that roost on the shelves of the grog shops and hoot above the dead. I am often asked to what political party I belong, and I now declare my opinion of the political parties today. Each one is worse than the other, and the only consolation in regard to them is that they have putrefied until they have no more power to rot. Oh, that comparatively tame scene upon which Rizpah looked. She looked upon only 7 of the slain. American motherhood and American wifehood this moment are looking upon 70 of the slain, upon 700 of the slain, upon 70,000 of the slain. Woe, woe, woe! My only consolation on this subject is that foreign capitalists are buying up the American breweries. The present owners see that the doom of that business is coming as surely as that God is not dead. They are unloading upon foreign capitalists, and when we can get these breweries into the hands of people living on the other side of the sea, our political parties will cease to be afraid of the liquor traffic, and at their conventions nominating presidential candidates, will put in their platform a plank as big as the biggest plank of the biggest ocean steamer, saying, "Resolved unanimously that we always have been and always will be opposed to alcoholism." But I must spur on our Arab steed, and here we come in sight of Beeroth, said to be the place where Joseph and Mary missed the boy Jesus on the way from Jerusalem to Nazareth, going home from a great national festival. "Where is my child Jesus?" says Mary. "Where is my child Jesus?" says Joseph. Among the thousands that are returning from Jerusalem, they thought that certainly he was walking on in the crowd. They described him, saying, "He is 12 years old, and of light complexion and blue eyes, a lost child." Great excitement in all the crowd. Nothing so stirs folks as the news that a child is lost. I shall not forget the scene when, in a great outdoor meeting, I was preaching, and someone stepped on the platform and said that a child was lost. We went on with the religious service, but all our minds were on the lost child. After a while, a man brought on the platform a beautiful little tot that looked like a piece of heaven dropped down, and said, "Here is that child." And I forgot all that I was preaching about, and lifted the child to my shoulder and said, "Here is the lost child, and the mother will come and get her right away, or I will take her home and add her to my own brood." And some cried and some shouted, and amid all that crowd I instantly detected the mother. Everybody had to get out of her way or be walked over. Hats were nothing, and shoulders were nothing, and heads were nothing in her pathway, and I realized something of what must have been Mary's anxiety when she lost Jesus, and what her gladness when she found her boy in the temple of Jerusalem, talking with those old ministers of religion, Shammai, Hillel, and Betira. I bear down on you today with a mighty comfort. Mary and Joseph said, "Where is our Jesus?" And you say, "Where is John?" or "Where is Hendrie?" or "Where is George?" Well, I should not wonder if you found him after a while. Where? In the same place where Joseph and Mary found their boy, in the temple. What do I mean by that? I mean, you do your duty toward God and toward your child, and you will find him after a while in the kingdom of Christ. Will you say, "I do not have any way of influencing my child"? I answer, you have the most tremendous line of influence open right before you. As you write a letter, and there are 2 or 3 routes by which it may go, but you want it to go the quickest route, and you put on it via Southampton, or via San Francisco, or via Marseille. Put on your wishes about your child, via the throne of God. How long will such a good wish take to get to its destination? Not quite as long as the millionth part of a second. I will prove it. The promise is, "Before they call, I will answer." That means, at your first motion towards such prayerful exercise, the blessing will come. And if the prayer be made at 10 o'clock at night, it will be answered 5 minutes before 10. Before they call, I will answer. Well, you say, I am clear discouraged about my son, and I am getting on in years, and I fear I will not live to see him converted. Perhaps not. Nevertheless, I think you will find him in the temple, the heavenly temple. There has not been an hour in heaven, the last 100 years, when parents in glory have not had announced to them the salvation of children whom they left in this world profligate. We often have to say, I forgot, but God has never yet once said, I forgot. It may be, after the grass of 30 summers have greened the top of your grave, that your son may be found in the earthly temple. It may be 50 years from now, when some morning the towers are chiming the matins of the glorified in heaven, that you shall find him in the higher temple, which has no need of candle or of sun, for the Lord God and the Lamb are the light thereof. Cheer up, Christian father and mother, cheer up. Where Joseph and Mary found their boy, you will find yours, in the temple. You see, God could not afford to do otherwise. One of the things he has positively promised in the Bible is that he will answer earnest and believing prayer. Failing to do that, he would wreck his own throne, and the foundations of his palace would give way, and the bank of heaven would suspend payment, and the dark word repudiation would be written across the sky, and the eternal government would be disbanded, and God himself would become an exile. Keep on with your prayer, and you will yet find your child in the temple, either the temple here or the temple above. Out on the western prairies was a happy but isolated home. Father, mother, and child. By the sale of cattle, quite a large sum of money was won night in that cabin, and the father was away. A robber who had heard of the money one night looked in at the window, and the wife and mother of that home saw him, and she was helpless. Her child by her side, she knelt down and prayed, among other things, for all prodigals who were wandering up and down the world. The robber heard her prayer and was overwhelmed, and entered the cabin and knelt beside her and began to pray. He had come to rob that house, but the prayer of that woman for prodigals reminded him of his mother and her prayers before he became a vagabond, and from that hour he began a new life. Years after, that woman was in a city in a great audience, and the orator who came on the platform and pled gloriously for righteousness and God was the man who many years before had looked into the cabin on the prairie as a robber. The speaker and the auditor immediately recognized each other. After so long a time, a mother's prayers answered. But we must hurry on, for the muleteers and baggage men have been ordered to pitch our tents for tonight at Bethel. It is already getting so dark that we have to give up all idea of guiding the horses, and I leave them to their own sagacity. We ride down amid mud cabins and into ravines where the horses leap from depth to depth, rocks below rocks, rocks under rocks. Whoa! Whoa! We dismount in this place, memorable for many things in Bible history. The two more prominent, a theological seminary, where of old they made ministers, and for Jacob's dream. The students of this Bethel Theological Seminary were called Sons of the Prophets. Here the young men were fitted for the ministry, and those of us who ever had the advantage of such institutions will everlastingly be grateful. And in the calendar of saints, which I read with especial affection, are the doctors of divinity who blessed me with their care. I thank God that from these theological seminaries there is now coming forth a magnificent crop of young ministers who are taking the pulpits in all parts of the land. I hail their coming, and tell these young brothers to shake off their somnolence of centuries and get out from under the dusty shelves of theological discussions, which have no practical bearing on this age, which needs to get rid of its sins and have its sorrows comforted. Many of our pulpits are dying of humdrum. People do not go to church because they cannot endure the technicalities and profound explanations of nothing, and sermons about the eternal generation of the Son, and the difference between sublapsarianism and supralapsarianism, and about who Melchizedek wasn't. There ought to be as much difference between the modes of presenting truth now and in olden time as between a lightning express rail train and a canal boat. Years ago I went up to the door of a factory in New England. On the outside door I saw the words "No Admittance." I went in and came to another door over which were the words "No Admittance." Of course I went in and came to the third door inscribed with the words "No Admittance." Having entered this, I found the people inside making pins, beautiful pins, useful pins, and nothing but pins. So over the outside door of many of the churches has been practically written the words "No Admittance." Some have entered and have come to the inside door and found the words "No admittance." But persisting, they have come inside and found us sounding out our little niceties of belief, pointing out our little differences of theological sentiment, making pins. But most distinguished was Bethel for that famous dream which Jacob had, his head on a collection of stones. He had no trouble in this rocky region in finding a rocky pillow. There is hardly anything else but stone. Yet the people of those lands had a way of drawing their outer garment up over their head and face, and such a pillow I suppose Jacob had under his head. The plural was used in the Bible story, and you find it was not a pillow of stone, but of stones, I suppose, so that if one proved to be of uneven surface, he would turn over in the night and take another stone. For with such a hard bolster, he would often change in the night. Well, that night God built in Jacob's dream a long, splendid ladder, the feet of it on either side of the tired pilgrim's pillow, and the top of it mortised in the sky. And bright immortals came out from the castles of amber and gold, and put their shining feet on the shining rungs of the ladder, and they kept coming down and going up, a procession both ways. Suppose they had wings, for the Bible almost always reports them as having wings. But this was a ladder on which they used hands and feet, to encourage all those of us who have no wings to climb, and encouraging us to believe that, if we will use what we have, God will provide a way, and if we will employ the hand and the foot, He will furnish the ladder. Young man, do not wait for wings. Those angels folded theirs to show you wings are not necessary. Let all the people who have hard pillows, hard for sickness, or hard for poverty, or hard for persistence, know that a hard pillow is the landing place of angels. They seldom descend to pillows of eiderdown. They seldom build dreams in the brain of the one who sleeps easy. The greatest dream of all time was that of St. John, with his head on the rocks of Patmos. And in that vision he heard the 7 trumpets sounded, and saw all the pomp of heaven, in procession cherubic, seraphic, archangelic. The next most memorable and glorious dream was that of John Bunyan, his pillow the cold stone of the door of Bedford Jail, from which he saw the celestial city, and so many entering it, he cried out in his dream, "I wish myself among them." The next most wonderful dream was that of Washington, sleeping on the ground at Valley Forge, his head on a white pillow-case of snow, where he saw the vision of a nation emancipated. Columbus slept on a weaver's pillow, but rose on the ladder let down until he could see a new hemisphere. Demosthenes slept on a cutter's pillow, but on the ladder let down arose to see the mighty assemblage that were to be swayed by his oratory. Arkwright slept on a barber's pillow, but went up the ladder till he could see all England a-quake with the factories he set going. Akenside slept on the butcher's pillow, and took the ladder up till he saw other generations helped by his scholarship. John Ashworth slept on a poor man's pillow, but took the ladder up until he could see his prayers and exertions bringing thousands of the destitute in England to salvation and heaven. Nearly all those who are today great in merchandise, in statesmanship, in law, in medicine, in art, in literature, were once at the foot of the ladder, and in their boyhood had a pillow hard as Jacob's. They who are born at the top of the ladder are apt to spend their lives in coming down, while those who are at the foot, and their head on a boulder, if they have the right kind of dream, are almost sure to rise. I noticed that those angels, either in coming down or going up on Jacob's ladder, took it rung by rung. They did not leap to the bottom, nor jump to the top. So you are to rise. Faith added to faith, good deed to good deed, industry to industry, consecration to consecration, until you reach the top, rung by rung. Gradual going up from a block of granite to pillar of throne. That night at Bethel, I stood in front of my tent and looked up, and the heavens were full of ladders. First a ladder of clouds, then a ladder of stars, and all up and down the heavens were angels of beauty, angels of consolation, angels of God ascending and descending. Surely God is in this place, said Jacob, and I knew it not. But tonight God is in this place, and I know it. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of 25 Sermons on the Holy Land. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendrie. 25 Sermons on the Holy Land by DeWitt Talmage. Incidents in Palestine. Forasmuch as thou knowest how we are to encamp in the wilderness. Numbers chapter 10 verse 31. Night after night we have slept in tent in Palestine. There are large villages of Bedouins without a house, and for 3,000 years the people of those places have lived in black tents made out of dyed skins. And when the winds and storms wore out and tore loose those coverings, others of the same kind took their places. Noah lived in a tent, Abraham in a tent, Jacob pitched his tent on the mountain, Isaac pitched his tent in the valley, Lot pitched his tent toward Sodom. In a tent the woman Jael nailed Sisera the general to the ground, first having given him sour milk called leaven as a soporific to make him soundly sleep, that being the effect of such nutrition as modern travellers can testify. The Syrian army in a tent. The ancient battle shout was, "To your tents, O Israel!" Paul was a tent maker. Indeed, Isaiah, magnificently poetic, indicates that all the human race lived under a blue tent when he says that God stretcheth out the heavens as a curtain and spreadeth them out as a tent to dwell in. And Hezekiah compares death to the striking of a tent, saying, "My age is removed from me as a shepherd's tent." In our tent in Palestine tonight, I hear something I never heard before and hope never to hear again. It is the voice of a hyena amid the rocks nearby. When you may have seen this monster putting his mouth between the iron bars of a menagerie, he is a captive and he gives a mutilated and suppressed cry. But yonder, in the midnight, on a throne of rocks, he has nothing to fear, and he utters himself in a loud, resounding, terrific, almost supernatural sound, splitting up the darkness into a deeper midnight. It begins with a howl and ends with a sound something like a horse's whinnying. In the hyena's voice are defiance and strength and bloodthirstiness and crunch of broken bones and death. I am glad to say that, for the most part, Palestine is clear of beasts of prey. The leopards, which Jeremiah says cannot change their spots, have all disappeared, and the lions that once were common all through this land and used by all the prophets for illustrations of cruelty and wrath, have retreated before the discharges of gunpowder, of which they have an indescribable fear. But for the most part Palestine is what it originally was, with the one exception of a wire thread reaching from Joppa to Jerusalem, and from Jerusalem to Nazareth, and from Nazareth to Tiberias, and from Tiberias to Damascus. That one nerve of civilization, the telegraphic wire, for we found ourselves only a few minutes off from Brooklyn and New York while standing by Lake Galilee. With that one exception, Palestine is just as it always was. Nothing surprised me so much as the persistence of everything. A sheep or horse falls dead, and though the sky may 1 minute before be clear of all wings, in 5 minutes after, the skies are black with eagles cawing, screaming, plunging, fighting for room, contending for largest morsels of the extinct quadruped. Ah, now I understand the force of Christ's illustration when he said, "Wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together." The longevity of those eagles is wonderful. They live 50 or 60 and sometimes 100 years. And that explains what David meant when he says, "Thy youth is renewed like the eagles." I saw a shepherd with the folds of his coat far bent outward, and I wondered what was contained in that amplitude of apparel, and I said to the dragoman, "What has that shepherd got under his coat?" And the dragoman said, "It is a very young lamb he is carrying. It is too young and too weak and too cold to keep up with the flock." At that moment I saw the lamb put its head out from the shepherd's bosom, and I said, "There it is now, Isaiah's description of the tenderness of God. He shall gather the lambs with his arm and carry them in his bosom." Passing by a village home in the Holy Land about noon, I saw a great crowd in and around a private house, and I said to the dragoman, "David, what is going on there?" He said, "Somebody has recently died there, and their neighbours go in for several days after to sit down and weep with the bereaved." There it is, I said, the old scriptural custom, and many of the Jews came to Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Early in the morning, passing by a cemetery in the Holy Land, I saw among the graves about 50 women dressed in black, and they were crying, "Oh, my child! Oh, my husband! Oh, my father! Oh, my mother!" Our dragoman told us that every morning very early for 3 mornings after burial the women go to the sepulchre, and after that every week very early for a year. As I saw this group just after daybreak, I said, "There it is again, the same old custom referred to in Luke, the evangelist, where he says, 'certain women which were early at the sepulchre.'" But here we found ourselves at Jacob's Well, the most famous well in history, most distinguished for 2 things, because it belonged to the old patriarch after whom it was named, and for the wonderful things which Christ said, seated on this well curb, to the Samaritan woman. We dismount from our horses in a drizzling rain, and our dragoman climbing up to the well over the slippery stones stumbles and frightens us all by nearly falling into it. I measured the well at the top and found it 6 feet from edge to edge. Some grass and weeds and thorny growths overhang it. In one place the roof is broken through. Large stones embank the wall on all sides. Our dragoman took pebbles and dropped them in, and from the time they left his hand to the instant they clicked on the bottom, you could hear it was deep, though not as deep as once, for every day travellers are applying the same test. And though in the time of Mondrel the traveller, the well was 165 feet deep, now it is only 75. So great is the curiosity of the world to know about that well, that during the dry season a Captain Anderson descended into this well, at one place the sides so close he had to put his hands over his head in order to get through, and then he fainted away and lay at the bottom of the well as though dead, until hours after recovery he came to the surface. It is not like other wells digged down to a fountain that fills it, but a reservoir to catch the falling rains. And to that Christ refers when speaking to the Samaritan woman about a spiritual supply. He said that he would, if asked, have given her living water. That is, water from a flowing spring, in distinction from the water of that well, which was rainwater. But why did Jacob make a reservoir there, when there is plenty of water all around, and abundance of springs and fountains? and seemingly no need of that reservoir. Why did Jacob go to the vast expense of boring and digging a well, perhaps 200 feet deep, as first completed, when by going a little way off, he could have water from other fountains at little or no expense? Jacob was wise. He wanted his own well. Quarrels and wars might arise with other tribes, and the supply of water might be cut off. So the shovels and pickaxes and boring instruments were ordered, and the well of nearly 4,000 years ago was sunk through the solid rock. When Jacob thus wisely insisted on having his own well, he taught us not to be unnecessarily dependent on others. Independence of business character, independence of moral character, independence of religious character. Have your own well of grace, your own well of courage, your own well of divine supply. If you are an invalid, you have a right to be dependent on others. But if God has given you good health, common sense, and 2 eyes and 2 ears and 2 hands and 2 feet, He equipped you for independence of all the universe except Himself. If He had meant you to be dependent on others, you would have been built with a cord around your waist to tie fast to somebody else. No, you are built with common sense to fashion your own opinions, with eyes to find your own way, with ears to select your own music, with hands to fight your own battles. There is only one being in the universe whose advice you need, and that is God. Have your own well, and the Lord will fill it. Dig it, if need be, through 200 feet of solid rock. Dig it with your pen, or dig it with your yardstick, or dig it with your shovel, or dig it with your Bible. In my small way, I never accomplished anything for God or the church, or the world, or my family, or myself, except in contradiction to human advice and in obedience to divine counsel. God knows everything, and what is the use of going for advice to human beings who know so little that no one but the all-seeing God can realize how little it is? I suppose that when Jacob began to dig this well on which we are sitting this noontide, people gathered round and said, "What a useless expense you are going to, when rolling down from yonder Mount Gerizim, and down from yonder Mount Ebal, and out yonder in the valley is plenty of water." "Oh," replied Jacob, "that is all true, but suppose my neighbours should get angered against me and cut off my supply of mountain beverage. What would I do? And what would my family do? And what would my flocks and herds do? Forward, ye brigade of pickaxes and crowbars, and go down into the depths of these rocks, and make me independent of all except Him who fills the bottles of the clouds. I must have my own well." Young man, drop cigars and cigarettes, and wine cups, and the Sunday excursions, and build your own house, and have your own wardrobe, and be your own capitalist. "Why, I have only $500 income a year," says someone. Then spend $400 of it in living, and 10% of it in beginning to dig your own well. Or if you have $1,000 a year, spend $800 of it in living, 10% or $100 in benevolence, and the remaining 100 in beginning to dig your own well. The largest bird that ever flew through the air was hatched out of 1 egg, and the greatest estate was brooded out of $1. I suppose when Jacob began to dig this well, on whose curb we are now seated this December noon, it was a dry season then as now, and someone comes up and says, "Now, Jacob, suppose you get the well 50 feet deep or 200 feet deep, and there should be no water to fill it. Would you not feel silly?" People passing along the road and looking down from Mount Gerizim or Mount Ebal nearby would laugh and say, "That is Jacob's well, a great hole in the rock, illustrating the man's folly." Jacob replied, There never has been a well in Palestine or any other country that once thoroughly dug was not sooner or later filled from the clouds, and this will be no exception. For months after Jacob had completed the well, people went by and, out of respect for the deluded old man, put their hand over their mouth to hide a snicker, and the well remained as dry as the bottom of a kettle that had been hanging over the fire for 3 hours. But one day the sun was drawing water, and the wind got round to the east, and it began to drizzle, and then great drops splashed all over the well curb, and the heavens opened their reservoir, and the rainy season poured its floods for 6 weeks, and there came maidens to the well with empty pails, and carried them away full, and the camels thrust their mouths into the troughs, and were satisfied. And the water was in the well 3 feet deep, and 50 feet deep, and 200 feet deep, and all the Bedouins of the neighbourhood and all the passers-by realized that Jacob was wise in having his own well. My hearer, it is your part to dig your own well, and it is God's part to fill it. You do your part, and he will do his part. Much is said about good luck, but people who are industrious and self-denying almost always have good luck. You can afford to be laughed at because of your application and economy, for when you get your well dug and filled, it will be your turn to laugh. But look up from this famous well and see 2 mountains and the plain between them, on which was gathered the largest religious audience that ever assembled on earth, about 500,000 people. Mount Gerizim, about 800 feet high, on one side, and on the other Mount Ebal, the former called the Mount of Blessing, and the latter called the Mount of Cursing. At Joshua's command, 6 tribes stood on Mount Gerizim, and read the blessings for keeping the law, and 6 tribes stood on Mount Ebal reading the curses for breaking the law, while the 500,000 people on the plain cried Amen, with an emphasis that must have made the earth tremble. I do not believe that, says someone, for those mountain tops are 2 miles apart, and how could a voice be heard from top to top? My answer is that while the tops are 2 miles apart, the bases of the mountains are only half a mile apart, and the tribes stood on the sides of the mountains, and the air is so clear, and the acoustic qualities of this great natural amphitheatre so perfect, that voices can be distinctly heard from mountain to mountain, as has been demonstrated by travellers 50 times in the last 50 years. Can you imagine anything more thrilling and sublime and overwhelming than what transpired on those 2 mountainsides and in the plain between, when the responsive service went on and thousands of voices on Mount Gerizim cried, Blessed shalt thou be in the city, and blessed shalt thou be in the fields, blessed shall be thy basket and thy store. And then from Mount Ebal, thousands of voices responded, crying, Cursed be he that removeth his neighbour's landmark. Cursed be he that maketh the blind to wander out of the way. And then there rolled up from all the spaces between the mountains that one word with which the devout of earth close their prayers, and the glorified of heaven finish their doxologies. Amen, Amen. That scene only to be surpassed by the times which are coming, when the churches and the academies of music and the auditoriums of earth, no longer large enough to hold the worshippers of God, the parks, the mountainsides, the great natural amphitheatres of the valleys, shall be filled with the outpouring populations of the earth, and mountain shall reply to mountain, as Mount Gerizim to Mount Ebal, and all the people shall ascribe riches and honour and glory and dominion and victory to God the Lamb. And there shall arise an Amen, like the booming of the heavens mingling with the thunder of the seas. On and on we ride until now we have come to Shiloh, a dead city on a hill surrounded by rocks, sheep, goats, olive gardens and vineyards. Here good Eli fell backward and broke his neck, and lay dead, at the news from his bad boys Phineas and Hophni. And life is not worth living after one's children have turned out badly. And more fortunate was Eli, instantly expiring under such tidings, than those parents who, their children recreant and profligate, live on with broken hearts to see them going down with deeper and deeper plunge. There are fathers and mothers here today to whom death would be happy release because of their recreant sons. And if there be recreant sons here present, and your parents be far away, why not bow your head in repentance, and at the close of this service go to the telegraph office and put it on the wing of the lightning that you have turned from your evil ways. Before another 24 hours have passed, take your feet off the sad hearts at the old homestead. Home to thy God, O prodigal. Many, many letters do I get in purport saying, "My son is in your cities. We have not heard from him for some time. We fear something is wrong. Hunt him up and say a good word to him. His mother is almost crazy about him. He is a child of many prayers. But how can I hunt him up unless he be in this audience? Where are you, my boy? On the main floor, or on this platform, or in these boxes, or in these great galleries? Where are you? Lift your right hand. I have a message from home. Your father is anxious about you. Your mother is praying for you. Your God is calling for you. Or will you wait until Eli falls back lifeless, and the heart against which you lay in infancy ceases to beat? What a story to tell in eternity that you killed her. My God, avert that catastrophe. But I turn from this Shiloh of Eli's sudden decease under bad news from his boys, and find close by what is called the meadow of the feast. While this ancient city was in the height of its prosperity, on this meadow of the feast there was an annual ball, where the maidens of the city, amid clapping cymbals and a blare of trumpets, danced in a glee upon which thousands of spectators gazed. But no dance, since the world stood, ever broke up in such a strange way as the one the Bible describes. One night, while by the light of the lamps and torches these gaieties went on, 200 Benjamites, who had been hidden behind the rocks and among the trees, dashed upon the scene. They came not to injure or destroy, but wishing to set up households of their own, the women of their own land having been slain in battle. And by preconcerted arrangement, each one of the 200 Benjamites seized the one whom he chose for the queen of his home, and carried her away to large estate and beautiful residence, for these 200 Benjamites had inherited the wealth of a nation. As today near Shiloh we look at the meadow of the feast, where the maidens danced that night, and at the mountain gorge up which the Benjamites carried their brides, we bethink ourselves of the better times in which we live, when such scenes are an impossibility, and amid orderly groups, and with prayer and benediction, and breath of orange blossoms, and the roll of the wedding march, marriage is solemnized, and with oath recorded in heaven. Two immortals start arm in arm on a journey to last until death do them part. Upon every such marriage altar may there come the blessing of him who setteth the solitary in families, side by side on the path of life, side by side in their graves, side by side in heaven. But we must, this afternoon, our last day before reaching Nazareth, pitch our tent on the most famous battlefield of all time, the plain of Esdraelon. What must have been the feelings of the Prince of Peace as he crossed it on the way from Jerusalem to Nazareth? Not a flower blooms there but has in its veins the inherited blood of flowers that drank the blood of fallen armies. Hardly a foot of the ground that has not at some time been gullied with war chariots or trampled with the hoofs of cavalry. It is a plain reaching from the Mediterranean to the Jordan. Upon it look down the mountains of Tabor and Gilboa and Carmel. Through it rages at certain seasons the river Kishon, which swept down the armies of Sisera. the battle occurring in November, when there is almost always a shower of meteors, so that the stars in their courses were said to have fought against Sisera. Through this plain drove Jehu and the iron chariots of the Canaanites, scythed at the hubs of the wheels, hewing down their awful swathes of death, thousands in a minute. The Syrian armies, the Turkish armies, the Egyptian armies again and again trampled it. There they career across it, David and Joshua and Godfrey and Richard Coeur de Lion and Baldwin and Saladin. A plain not only famous for the past, but famous because the Bible says the great decisive battle of the world will be fought there, the Battle of Armageddon. To me, the plain was the more absorbing because of the desperate battles here and in regions round, in which the Holy Cross, the very two pieces of wood on which Jesus was supposed to have been crucified, was carried as a standard at the head of the Christian host. And that night, closing my eyes in my tent on the plain of Esdraelon, for there are some things we can see better with eyes shut than open, the scenes of that ancient war come before me. The 12th century was closing, and Saladin, at the head of 80,000 mounted troops, was crying, "Ho for Jerusalem! Ho for all Palestine!" And before them everything went down, but not without unparalleled resistance. In one place 130 Christians were surrounded by many thousands of furious Mohammedans. For one whole day the 130 held out against these thousands. Tennyson's 600, when "someone had blundered," were eclipsed by these 130 fighting for the Holy Cross. They took hold the lances which had pierced them with death wounds, and pulling them out of their own breasts and side, hurled them back again at the enemy. On went the fight until all but one Christian had fallen, and he, mounted on the last horse, wielded his battle-axe right and left, till his horse fell under the plunge of the javelins, and the rider, making the sign of the cross toward the sky, gave up his life on the point of a score of spears. But soon after, the last battle came. History portrays it, poetry chants it, painting colours it, and all ages admire that last struggle to keep in possession the wooden cross on which Jesus was said to have expired. It was a battle in which mingled the fury of devils and the grandeur of angels. Thousands of dead Christians on this side, thousands of dead Mohammedans on the other side. The battle was hottest close around the wooden cross upheld by the Bishop of Ptolemais, himself wounded and dying. And when the Bishop of Ptolemais dropped dead, the Bishop of Lynda seized the cross and again lifted it, carrying it onward into a wilder and fiercer fight. And sword against javelin, and battle-axe upon helmet, and piercing spear against splintering shield. Horses and men tumbled into heterogeneous death. Now the wooden cross on which the armies of Christians had kept their eye begins to waver, begins to descend. It falls, and the wailing of the Christian host at its disappearance drowns the huzzah of the victorious Muslims. But that standard of the cross only seemed to fall. It rides the sky today in triumph. 500 million souls, the mightiest army of the ages, are following it, and where that goes they will go, across the earth and up the mighty steps of the heavens. In the 12th century it seemed to go down, but in the 19th century it is the mightiest symbol of glory and triumph, and means more than any other standard, whether inscribed with eagle or lion or bear or star or crescent. That which Saladin trampled on the plain of Esdraelon, I lift today for your marshalling. The cross, the cross, the foot of it planted in the earth it saves, the top of it pointing to the heavens to which it will take you, and the outspread beam of it like outstretched arms of invitation to all nations. Kneel at its foot, lift your eye to its victim, swear eternal allegiance to its power. And as that mighty symbol of pain and triumph is kept before us, we will realize how insignificant are the little crosses we are called to bear, and we will more cheerfully carry them. Must Jesus bear the cross alone, and all the world go free? No, there's a cross for everyone, and there's a cross for me. As I fall asleep tonight on my pillow in the tent on the plain of Esdraelon, reaching from the Mediterranean to the Jordan, the waters of the river Kishon soothing me, as by a lullaby, I hear the gathering of the hosts for the last battle of all the earth, and by their representatives America is here, and Europe is here, and Asia is here, and Africa is here, and all heaven is here, and all hell is here. And Apollyon on the black horse leads the armies of darkness, and Jesus on the white horse leads the armies of light. And I hear the roll of the drums, and the clear call of the clarions, and the thunder of the cannonades. And then I hear the wild rush as of millions of troops in retreat, and then the shout of victory as from 1,400 million throats, and then a song as though all the armies of earth and heaven were joining in it, clapping cymbals, beating the time. The kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign for ever and ever. End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of 25 Sermons on the Holy Land. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 25 Sermons on the Holy Land by Thomas DeWitt Talmage. Among the Holy Hills. He came to Nazareth, where he was brought up. Luke 4:16. What a splendid sleep I had last night in a Catholic convent, my first sleep within doors since leaving Jerusalem, and all of us as kindly treated as though we had been the Pope and his college of cardinals passing that way. Last evening, the genial sisterhood of the convent ordered 100 bright-eyed Arab children brought out to sing for me, and it was glorious. This morning I came out on the steps of the convent and look upon the most beautiful village of all Palestine, its houses of white limestone. Guess its name. Nazareth, historical Nazareth, one of the trinity of places that all Christian travelers must see, or feel that they have not seen Palestine, namely, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Nazareth. Babyhood, boyhood, manhood of him for whom I believe there are 50 million people who would now, if it were required, march out and die, whether under axe or down in the floods, or straight through the fire. Grand old village is Nazareth, even putting aside its sacred associations. First of all, it is clean, and that can be said of few of the Oriental villages. Its neighboring town of Nablus is the filthiest town I ever saw, although its chief industry is the manufacture of soap. They export all of it. Nazareth was perhaps unusually clean the morning I speak of, for, as we rode into the village the afternoon before, the showers which had put our mackintoshes to the test had poured floods through all the alleys under command of the Clouds, those thorough street commissioners. Besides that, Nazareth has been the scene of battles passing it from Israelite to Mohammedan and from Mohammedan to Christian, the most wonderful of the battles being that in which 25,000 Turks were beaten by 2,100 French, Napoleon Bonaparte commanding, that greatest of Frenchmen walking these very streets through which Jesus walked for nearly 30 years, the morals of the two the antipodes, the snows of Russia and the plagues of Egypt appropriately following the one, the doxologies of earth and the hallelujahs of heaven appropriately following the other. And then this town is so beautifully situated in a great green bowl, the sides of the bowl the surrounding 15 hills. The God of nature, who is the God of the Bible, evidently scooped out this valley for privacy and separation from all the world during 3 most important decades, the 30 years of Christ's boyhood and youth, For of the 33 years of Christ's stay on earth, he spent 30 of them in this town getting ready, a startling rebuke to those who have no patience with the long years of preparation necessary when they enter on any special mission for the church or the world. The trouble is with most young men that they want to launch their ship from the dry dock before it is ready, and hence so many sink in the first cyclone. Stay in the store as a subordinate until you are thoroughly equipped. Be a good employee in your trade until you are qualified to be an employer. Be content with Nazareth until you are ready for the buffetings of Jerusalem. You may get so gloriously equipped in the 30 years that you can do more in 3 years than most men can accomplish in a prolonged lifetime. These little suggestions I am apt to put into my sermon, hoping to help people for this world, while I am chiefly anxious to have them prepare for the next world. All Christ's boyhood was spent in this village and its surroundings. There is the very well called the Fountain of the Virgin, to which, by his mother's side, he trotted along holding her hand. No doubt about it. It is the only well in the village, and it has been the only well for 3,000 years. This morning we visit it, and the mothers have their children with them now as then. The work of drawing water in all ages in these countries has been women's work. Scores of them are waiting for their turn at it. 3 great and everlasting springs rolling out into that well their barrels, their hogsheads of water in floods gloriously abundant. This well is surrounded by olive groves and wide spaces, in which people talk, and children, wearing charms on their heads as protection against the evil eye, are playing, and women with their strings of coin on either side of their face, and in skirts of blue and scarlet and white and green, move on with water jars on their heads. Mary, I suppose, almost always took Jesus the boy with her, for she had no one she could leave him with, being in humble circumstances and having no attendants. I do not believe there was one of the surrounding 15 hills that the boy Christ did not range from bottom to top, or one cavern in their sides he did not explore, nor one species of bird flying across the tops that he could not call by name, nor one of all the species of fauna browsing on those steeps that he had not recognized. You see it all through his sermons. If a man becomes a public speaker, in his orations or discourses you discover his early whereabouts. What a boy sees between 7 and 17 always sticks to him. When the Apostle Peter preaches, you see the fishing nets with which he had from his earliest days been familiar. And when Amos delivers his prophecy, you hear it in the bleating of the herds, which he had in boyhood attended. And in our Lord's sermons and conversations, you see all the phases of village life and the mountainous life surrounding it. They raised their own chickens in Nazareth, and in after time he cries, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often would I have gathered thee as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings." He had seen his mother open the family wardrobe at the close of summer, and the moth millers flying out, having destroyed the garments, and in after years he says, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth doth corrupt." In childhood he had seen a mile of flowers, white as the snow, or red as the flame, or blue as the sea, or green as the tree-tops, and no wonder in his manhood sermon he said, "Consider the lilies." While one day on a high point, where now stands the tomb of Nebi Ismael, he had seen winging past him so near as almost to flurry his hair, the partridge and the hoopoe and the thrush and the osprey and the crane and the raven, and no wonder afterward in his manhood sermon he said, "Behold the fowls of the air." In Nazareth and on the road to it there are a great many camels. I see them now in memory making their slow way up the zigzag road from the plain of Esdraelon to Nazareth. Familiar was Christ with their appearance, also with that small insect the gnat, which he had seen his mother strain out from the cup of water or pail of milk, And no wonder he brings forward the large quadruped and the small insect into his sermon, and, while seeing the Pharisees careful about small sins and reckless about large ones, cries out, "Woe unto you, blind guides, which strain out a gnat and swallow a camel." He had in boyhood seen the shepherds get their flocks mixed up, and to one not familiar with the habits of shepherds and their flocks, hopelessly mixed up. And a sheep stealer appears on the scene and dishonestly demands some of those sheep, when he owns not one of them. "Well," say the two honest shepherds, "we will soon settle this matter." And one shepherd goes out in one direction, and the other shepherd goes out in the other direction, and the sheep stealer in another direction, and each one calls, and the flocks of each of the honest shepherds rush to their owner, while the sheep stealer calls and calls again, but gets not one of the flock. No wonder that Christ years after, preaching on a great occasion and illustrating his own shepherd qualities, says, "When he putteth forth his own sheep, he goeth before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice, and the stranger they will not follow, for they know not the voice of the stranger." The sides of these hills are terraced for grapes. The boy Christ had often stood with great, round eyes, watching the trimming of the grapevines. Clip goes the knife, and off falls a branch. The child Christ says to the farmer, "What do you do that for?" "Oh," says the farmer, "that is a dead branch, and it is doing nothing, and is only in the way, so I cut it off." Then the farmer with his sharp knife prunes from a living branch this and that tendril and the other tendril. "But," says the child Christ, "these twigs that you cut off now are not dead. What do you do that for?" "Oh," says the farmer, "we prune off these that the main branch may have more of the sap, and so be more fruitful." No wonder in after years Christ said in his sermon, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. Every branch in me that beareth not fruit he taketh away, and every branch that beareth fruit he purgeth it, that it may bring forth more fruit." Capital! No one who had not been a country boy could have said that. Streaks of nature all through Christ's sermons and conversations. When a pigeon descended upon Christ's head at his baptism in the Jordan, it was not the first pigeon he had seen. And then he has such wide sweep of discourse as you may imagine from one who has stood on the hills that overlook Nazareth. As far as I understand, Christ visited the Mediterranean Sea only once, but any clear morning he could run up on a hill near Nazareth and look off to the west and see the Mediterranean, while there in the north is snowy Mount Lebanon, clad as in white robe of ascension, and yonder on the east and southeast, Mount Gilboa, Mount Tabor, and Mount Gilead, and yonder in the south is the plain of Esdraelon, over which we rode yesterday on our way to Nazareth. Those mountains of his boyhood, in his memory, do you wonder that Christ when he wanted a good pulpit made it out of a mountain? Seeing the multitudes, he went up into the mountain. And when he wanted a special communion with God, he took James and John and Peter into a mountain apart. Oh, this country boy of Nazareth, come forth to atone for the sins of the world, and to correct the follies of the world, and to stamp out the cruelties of the world, and to illumine the darkness of the world, and to transfigure the hemispheres. So it has been the mission of the country boys in all ages to transform and inspire and rescue. They come into our merchandise and our courtrooms and our healing art and our studios and our theology. They lived in Nazareth before they entered Jerusalem. And but for that annual influx, our cities would have enervated and sickened and slain the race. Late hours and hurtful apparel and overtaxed digestive organs and crowded environments of city life would have halted the world, but the valleys and mountains of Nazareth have given fresh supply of health and moral invigoration to Jerusalem, and the country saves the town. From the hills of New Hampshire and the hills of Virginia and the hills of Georgia come into our national eloquence the Websters and the Clays and the Henry W. Gradys. From the plain homes of Massachusetts and Maryland come into our national charities the George Peabodys and the William Corcorans. From the cabins of the lonely country regions come into our national destinies the Andrew Jacksons and the Abraham Lincolns. From Plowboy's Furrow and Village Counter and Blacksmith's Forge come most of our city giants. Nearly all the messiahs in all the departments dwelt in Nazareth before they came to Jerusalem. I send this day thanks from these cities, mostly made prosperous by country boys, to the farmhouse and the prairies and the mountain cabins and the obscure homesteads of North and South and East and West, to the fathers and mothers in plain homespun, if they be still alive, or the hillocks under which they sleep the long sleep. Thanks from Jerusalem to Nazareth. But alas, that the city should so often treat the country boys as of old the one from Nazareth was treated at Jerusalem. Slain not by hammers and spikes, but by instruments just as cruel. On every street of every city the crucifixion goes on. Every year shows its 10,000 of the slain. Oh, how we grind them up! Under what wheels, and in what mills, and for what an awful grist! Let the city take better care of these boys and young men arriving from the country. They are worth saving. They are now only the preface of what they will be, if, instead of sacrificing, you help them. Boys as grand as the one who with his elder brother climbed into a church tower, and not knowing their danger went outside on some timbers, when one of those timbers broke and the boys fell, and the older boy caught on a beam, and the younger clutched the foot of the older. The older could not climb up with the younger hanging to his feet. So the younger said, "John, I am going to let go. You can climb out into safety, but you can't climb up with me holding fast. I am going to let go. Kiss mother for me, and tell her not to feel badly. Good-bye." And he let go, and was so hard dashed upon the ground he was not recognizable. Plenty of such brave boys coming up from Nazareth. Let Jerusalem be careful how it treats them. A gentleman long ago entered a school in Germany, and he bowed very low before the boys, and the teacher said, "Why do you do that?" "Oh," said the visitor, "I do not know what mighty man may yet be developed among them." At that instant the eyes of one of the boys flashed fire. Who was it? Martin Luther. A lad on his way to school passed a doorstep on which sat a lame and invalid child. The passing boy said to him, "Why don't you go to school?" "Oh, I am lame. I can't walk to school." "Get on my back," said the well boy, "and I will carry you to school." And so he did, that day, and for many days, until the invalid was fairly started on the road to an education. Who was the well boy that did that kindness? I don't know. Who was the invalid he carried? It was Robert Hall, the rapt pulpit orator of all Christendom. Better give to the boys who come up from Nazareth to Jerusalem a crown instead of a cross. On this December morning in Palestine, on our way out from Nazareth, we saw just such a carpenter's shop as Jesus worked in, supporting his widowed mother after he was old enough to do so. I looked in, and there were hammer and saw and plane and auger and vise and measuring rule and chisel and drill and adze and wrench and bit and all the tools of carpentry. Think of it! He who smoothed the surface of the earth shoving a plane. He who cleft the mountains by earthquake pounding a chisel. He who opened the mammoth caves of the earth turning an auger. He who wields the thunderbolt striking with a hammer. He who scooped out the bed for the ocean hollowing a ladle. He who flashes the morning on the earth and makes the midnight heavens quiver with aurora constructing a window. I cannot understand it, but I believe it. A skeptic said to an old clergyman, I will not believe anything I cannot explain." "Indeed," said the clergyman. "Will you not believe anything you cannot explain? Please to explain to me why some cows have horns and others have no horns." "No," said the skeptic, "I do not mean exactly that. I mean that I will not believe anything I have not seen." "Indeed," said the clergyman. "Will you not believe anything you have not seen? Have you a backbone?" "Yes," said the skeptic. "How do you know?" said the clergyman. "Have you ever seen it?" This mystery of Godhead and humanity interjoined I cannot understand, and I cannot explain, but I believe it. I am glad there are so many things we cannot understand, for that leaves something for heaven. If we knew everything here, heaven would be a great indolence. What foolish people those who are in perpetual fret because they cannot understand all that God says and does. A child in the first juvenile primer might as well burst into tears because it cannot understand conic sections. In this world we are only in the A-B-C class, and we cannot now understand the libraries of eternity which put to utmost test faculties archangelic. I would be ashamed of heaven if we do not know more there, with all our faculties intensified a millionfold and at the center of the universe, than we do here with our dim faculties and clinging to the outside rim of the universe. In about 2 hours we passed through Cana, the village of Palestine where the mother of Christ and our Lord attended the wedding of a poor relative, and having come over from Nazareth for that purpose. The mother of Christ, for women are first to notice such things, found that the provisions had fallen short, and she told Christ, and he, to relieve the embarrassment of the housekeeper, who had invited more guests than the pantry warranted, became butler of the occasion, and out of a cluster of a few sympathetic words squeezed a beverage of 126 gallons of wine, in which was not one drop of intoxicant, or it would have left that party as maudlin and drunk as the great centennial banquet in New York 2 years ago left senators and governors and generals and merchant princes. The difference between the wine at the wedding in Cana and the wine at the banquet in New York being that the Lord made one and the devil made the other. We got off our horses and examined some of these water jars at Cana, said to be the very ones that held the plain water that Christ turned into the purple bloom of an especial vintage. I measured them and found them 18 inches from edge to edge and 19 inches deep, and declined to accept their identity. But we realized the immensity of a supply of 126 gallons of wine. What was that for? Probably 1 gallon would have been enough, for it was only an additional installment of what had already been provided, and it is probable that the housekeeper could not have guessed more than 1 gallon out of the way. But 126 gallons! What will they do with the surplus? Ah, it was just like our Lord. These young people were about to start in housekeeping, and their means were limited, and that big supply, whether kept in their pantry or sold, will be a mighty help. You see, there was no strychnine, or logwood, or nux vomica in that beverage, and as the Lord made it, it would keep. He makes mountains and seas that keep thousands of years, and certainly he could make a beverage that would keep for 4 or 5 years. Among the arts and inventions of the future, I hope there may be someone that can press the juices from the grape, and so mingle them, and without 1 drop of damning alcoholism, that it will keep for years. And the more of it you take, the clearer will be the brain, and the healthier the stomach. And here is a remarkable fact in my recent journey. I traveled through Italy, Greece, and Egypt, and Palestine, and Syria, and Turkey. And how many intoxicated people do you think I saw in all those 5 great realms? Not one. We must in our Christianized lands have got hold of some kind of beverage that Christ did not make. Oh, I am glad that Jesus was present at that wedding. And last December, standing at Cana, that wedding came back. Night had fallen on the village and its surroundings. The bridegroom had put on his head a bright turban and a garland of flowers, and his garments had been made fragrant with frankincense and camphor, an odor which the Oriental especially likes. Accompanied by groomsmen and preceded by a band of musicians with flutes and drums and horns, and by torches in full blaze, he starts for the bride's home. This river of fire is met by another river of fire, the torches of the bride and bridesmaids, flambeau answering flambeau. The bride is in white robe, and her veil not only covers her face, but envelops her body. Her trousseau is as elaborate as the resources of her father's house permit. Her attendants are decked with all the ornaments they own or can borrow. But their own personal charms make tame the jewels, for those Oriental women eclipse in attractiveness all others except those of our own land. The damson rose is in their cheek, and the diamond in the luster of their eyes, and the blackness of the night in their long locks, and in their step is the gracefulness of the morning. At the first sight of the torches of the bridegroom and his attendants coming over the hill, the cry rings through the home of the bride, "They are in sight! Get ready! Behold, the bridegroom cometh! Go ye out to meet him!" As the two processions approach each other, the timbrels strike and the songs commingle, and then the two processions become one, and march toward the bridegroom's house, and meet a third procession, which is made up of the friends of both bride and bridegroom. Then all enter the house, and the dance begins, and the door is shut. And all this Christ uses to illustrate the joy with which the ransomed of earth shall meet him when he comes garlanded with clouds, and robed in the morning, and trumpeted by the thunders of the last day. Look, there comes down off the hills of heaven the bridegroom, and let us start to hail him, for I hear the voices of the judgment day sounding, "Behold, the bridegroom cometh, go ye out to meet him." And the disappointment of those who have declined the invitation to the gospel wedding is presented under the figure of a door heavily closed. You hear it slam. Too late. The door is shut. But we must hasten on, for I do not mean to close my eyes tonight till I see from a mountain top Lake Galilee, on whose banks next Sabbath we will worship, and on whose waters the following morning we will take a sail. On and up we go to the severest climb of all Palestine, the ascent of the Mount of Beatitudes, on the top of which Christ preached that famous sermon on the Blesseds, blessed this and blessed that. Up to their knees the horses plunge in molehills, and a surface that gives way at the first touch of the hoof, and again the tired beasts halt, as much as to say to the rider, "It is unjust for you to make us climb these steeps." On and up over mountain sides, where in the later season hyacinths and daisies and phloxes and anemones kindle their beauty. On and on up, until on the rocks of black basalt we dismount, and climbing to the highest peak look out on an enchantment of scenery that seems to be the Beatitudes themselves arched into skies, and rounded into valleys, and silvered into waves. The view is like that of Tennessee and North Carolina from the top of Lookout Mountain, or like that of Vermont and New Hampshire from the top of Mount Washington. Hail, hills of Galilee! Hail, Lake Gennesaret, only 4 miles away! Yonder, clear up and most conspicuous, is Safed, the very city to which Christ pointed for illustration in the sermon preached here, saying, "A city set on a hill cannot be hid." There are rocks around me on this Mount of Beatitudes enough to build the highest pulpit the world ever saw. Aye, it is the highest pulpit. It overlooks all time and all eternity. The valley of Hattin between here and Lake Galilee is an amphitheater, as though the natural contour of the earth had invited all nations to come and sit down and hear Christ preach a sermon in which there were more startling novelties than were ever announced in all the sermons that were ever preached. To those who heard him on this very spot, his work must have seemed the contradiction of everything they had ever heard or read or experienced. The world's theory had been, "Blessed are the arrogant, blessed are the supercilious, blessed are the tearless, blessed are they that have everything their own way, blessed are the war eagles, blessed are the persecutors, blessed are the popular, blessed are the Herods and the Caesars and the Ahabs." No, 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 says Christ, with a voice that rings over these rocks, and through yonder valley of Hattin, and down to the opaline lake on one side and the sapphire Mediterranean on the other, and across Europe in one way, and across Asia in the other way, and around the earth both ways, till the globe shall be girdled with the 9 Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor, blessed are the mournful, blessed are the meek, blessed are the hungry, blessed are the merciful, blessed are the pure, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the persecuted, blessed are the falsely reviled. Do you see how the Holy Land and the Holy Book fit each other? God with his left hand built Palestine, and with his right wrote the Scriptures, the two hands of the same being. And in proportion as Palestine is brought under close inspection, the Bible will be found more glorious and more true. Mightiest book of the past, mightiest book of the future, monarch of all literature. The proudest works of genius shall decay, and reason's brightest lustre fade away, the sophist's art, the poet's boldest flight, shall sink in darkness and conclude in night. But faith triumphant over time shall stand, shall grasp the sacred volume in her hand, back to its source the heavenly gift convey, then in the flood of glory melt away. End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23 of 25 Sermons on the Holy Land. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendrie. 25 Sermons on the Holy Land by DeWitt Talmage. Our sail on Lake Galilee. He entered into a ship and sat in the sea, and the whole multitude was by the sea on the land. Mark chapter 4 verse 1. It is Monday morning in our Palestine experiences, and the sky is a blue Galilee above. As in the boat, we sail the blue Galilee beneath. It is 13 miles long and 6 miles wide, but the atmosphere is so clear it seems as if I could cast a stone from beach to beach. The lake looks as though it had been let down on silver pulleys from the heaven, and were a section of the sea of glass that St. John describes as a part of the celestial landscape. Lake Galilee is a depression of 600 feet in which the River Jordan widens and tarries a little, for the River Jordan comes in at its north side and departs from its south side, so this lake has its cradle and its grave. Its white satin cradle is among the snows of Mount Hermon, where the Jordan starts, and its sepulchre is the Dead Sea, into which the Jordan empties. Lake Como of Italy, Lake Geneva of Switzerland, Lake Lomond of Scotland, Lake Winnipesaukee of America are larger, but Lake Galilee is the greatest diamond that ever dropped from finger of the clouds, and whether encamped on its banks as we were yesterday, and worshipping at its crystal altars, or wading in its waves which make an ordinary bath solemn as a baptism, or now putting out upon its sparkling surface in a boat, it is something to talk about and pray about and sing about, until the lips with which we now describe it can neither talk nor pray nor sing. As sometimes a beautiful child in a neighbourhood has a half-dozen pet names, and some of the neighbours call her by one name and others by another, so this pet lake of the planet has a profusion of names. Ask the Arab as he goes by what this sheet of water is, and he will call it Tabariya. Ask Moses of the Old Testament, and he calls it Sea of Chinnereth. Ask Matthew, and he calls it Sea of Galilee. Ask Luke, and he calls it Sea of Gennesaret. Ask John, and he calls it Sea of Tiberias. Ask Josephus and Eusebius, and they have other names ready. But to me it appears a child of the sky, a star of the hills, a rhapsody of the mountains, the baptismal bowl of the world's temple, the smile of the great God. Many kinds of fish are found in these waters. Every kind of tree grows upon its bank, from those that grow in the torrid zone to those in the frigid, from the palm to the cedar. Of the 230 warships Josephus manoeuvred on these waters, for Josephus was a warrior as well as a historian, there remains not one piece of a hulk, or one patch of a canvas, or one splinter of an oar. But return to America we never will until we have had a sail upon this inland sea. Not from a wharf, but from a beach covered with black and white pebbles, we go on board a boat of about 10 or 12 tons, to be propelled partly by sail and partly by water. The mast leans so far forward that it seems about to fall, but we find it was purposely so built, and the rope through a pulley manages to hoist and let down the sail. It is a rough boat, and, as far as possible removed from a Venetian gondola or a sportsman's yacht, with a common saw and hammer and axe, many of you could make a better one. 4 barefooted Arabs, instead of sitting down to their oars, stand, as they always do in rowing, and pull away from shore. I insist on helping, for there is nothing more exhilarating to me than rowing, but I soon had enough of the clumsy oars and the awkward attempt at wielding them while in a standing posture. We put our overcoats and shawls on a small deck in the stern of the boat, the very kind of a deck where Christ lay on a fisherman's coat when of old a tempest pounced upon the fishing smack of the affrighted disciples. Ospreys and wild geese and kingfishers fly overhead or dip their wings into the lake, mistaking it for a fragment of fallen sky. Can it be that those Bible stories about sudden storms on this lake are true? Is it possible that a sea of such seeming placidity of temper could ever rise and rage at the heavens? It does not seem as if this happy family of elements could have ever had a falling out, and the water strike at the clouds, and the clouds strike at the water. Pull away, oarsmen. On our right bank are the hot sulphur baths, so hot they are scalding, and the waters must cool off a long while before hand or foot can endure their temperature. Volcanoes have been boiling these waters for centuries. 4 springs roll their resources into 2 great swimming reservoirs. King Herod there tried to bathe off the results of his excesses, and Pliny and Josephus describe the spurtings out of these volcanic heats, and Joshua and Moses knew about them, and this moment long lines of pilgrims from all parts of the earth are waiting for their turn to step into the steaming restoratives. Let the boat as far as possible, and not run aground. Hug the western shore of the lake, that we may see the city Tiberias, once a great capital, of the architecture of which a few mosaics and fallen pillars and pedestals, and here and there a broken and shattered frieze, remain, mightily suggestive of the time when Herod Antipas had a palace here, and reigned with an opulence and pomp, and cruelty and abomination, that paralyses the fingers of the historian when he comes to write it, and the fingers of the painter when he attempts to transfer it to canvas. I suppose he was one of the worst men that ever lived. And what a contrast of character comes at every moment to the thoughtful traveller in Palestine, whether he walks the beach of this lake or sails, as we do now, these waters. Side by side are the two great characters of this lake region, Jesus and Herod Antipas. And did any age produce any such antipodes, any such antitheses, any such opposites? Kindness and cruelty, holiness and filth, generosity and meanness, self-sacrifice and selfishness, the supernal and the infernal, mid-noon and midnight. The father of this Herod Antipas was a genius at assassination. He could manufacture more reasons for putting people out of this life than any man in all history. He sends for Hyrcanus to come from Babylon to Jerusalem to be made high priest, and slays him. He has his brother-in-law, while in bathing with him, drowned by the king's attendants. He slays his wife, and his wife's mother, and 2 of his sons, and his uncle, and filled a volume of atrocities, the last chapter of which was the massacre of all the babes at Bethlehem. With such a father as Herod the Great, you are not surprised that this Herod Antipas, whose palace stood on the banks of this lake we now sail, was a combination of wolf, reptile, and hyena. While the Christ who walked yonder banks and sailed these waters was so good that almost every rood of this scenery is associated with some wise word or some kindly deed, and all literature and all art and all earth and all heaven are put to the utmost effort in trying to express how grand and glorious and lovely he was, and is to be. The Christly and Herodic characters are different as the 2 lakes we visit, and not far apart, Galilee and the Dead Sea. The one flower-banked, and the other bituminous and blasted. The one hovered over by the mercy of Christ, the other blasted by the wrath of God. The one full of finny tribes, sporting in the clear depths, the other forever lifeless. The waters of the one sweet and pleasant to the taste, the other bitter and sharp and disgusting. Awful Dead Sea, glorious Gennesaret. We will not attempt to cross to the eastern side of this lake, as I had thought to do, for those regions are inhabited by a thieving and murderous race, and one must go thoroughly armed. And as I never shot anyone, and have no ambition to be shot, I said, let us stay by the western shore. But we look over to the hills of Gadara on the other side, down which 2,000 swine, after being possessed by the devil, ran into the lake, bringing down on the Christ, for permitting it, the wrath of all the stock raisers of that country, because of this ruining of the pork business. You see that Satan is a spirit of bad taste. Why did he not say, let me go into those birds, whole flocks of which fly over Galilee? No, that would have been too high. Why not let me go into the sheep which wander over these hills? No, that would have been too gentle. Rather let me go into these swine. I want to be with the denizens of the mire. I want to associate with the inhabitants of the filth. Great is mud. I prefer bristles to wings. I would rather root than fly. I like snout better than wing. Infidelity scoffs at the idea that those swine should have run into the lake. But it was quite natural that under the heat and burning of that demoniac possession, they would start for the water to get cooled off. Would that all the swine thus possessed had plunged into the same drowning, for to this day the descendants of some of those porcine creatures retain the demons, and as the devils were cast out of man into them, they now afflict the human race with the devils of scrofula that comes from eating the unclean meat. The healthiest people on earth are the Israelites, because they follow the bill of fare which God, in the book of Leviticus, gave to the human race, and our splendid French Dr. Pasteur and our glorious German Dr. Koch may go on with their good work of killing parasites in the human system. But until the world corrects its diet and goes back to the divine regulation at the beginning, the human race will continue to be possessed of the devils of microbe and parasite. But I did not mean to cross over to the eastern side of Lake Galilee, even in discussion. Pull away, ye Arab oarsmen, and we come along the shore, nearby which stand great precipices of brown and red and grey limestone, crowned by basalt, in the sides of which are vast caverns, sometimes the hiding place of bandits, and sometimes the home of honest shepherds, and sometimes the dwelling place of pigeons and vultures and eagles. During one of Herod's wars, his enemies hid in these mountain caverns, and the sides were too steep for Herod's army to descend, and the attempt to climb in the face of armed men would have called down extermination. So Herod had great cages of wood, iron-bound, made, and filled them with soldiers, and let them down from the top of the precipices, until they gave signal that they were level with the caverns, and then from these cages they stepped out to the mouth of the caverns, and having set enough grass and wood on fire to fill the caverns with smoke and strangulation, the hidden people would come forth to die, and if not coming forth voluntarily, Herod's men would pull them out with long iron hooks, and Josephus says that one father, rather than submit to the attacking army, flung his wife and 7 children down the precipice, and then leaped after them to his own death. Now, ye Arab oarsmen, row on with swifter stroke, for we want before noon to land at Capernaum, the 3 years' home of Jesus. But before arrival there, we are to have a new experience. The lake that had been a smooth surface begins to break up with rudeness. The air which all the morning made our sail almost useless suddenly takes hold of our boat with a grip astonishing, and our poor craft begins to roll and pitch and tumble, and in 5 minutes we pass from a calm to violence. The contour of this lake among the hills is an invitation to hurricanes. I used to wonder why it was that on so limited a sheet of water a bestormed boat in Christ's time did not put back to shore when a hurricane was coming. I wonder no more. On that lake an atmospheric fury gives no warning, and the change we saw in 5 minutes made me feel that the boat in which Christ sailed may have been skilfully managed when the tempest struck it, and the wild importunate cry went up, "Lord, save us, or we perish." I had all along that morning been reading from the New Testament the story of occurrences on or around that lake. But our Bible was closed now, and it was as much as we could do to hold fast and wish for the land. If the winds and the waves had continued to increase in violence the following 15 minutes in the same ratio as in the first 5, and we had been still at their mercy, our bones would have been bleaching at the bottom of Lake Gennesaret, instead of our being here to tell the story. But the same power that rescued the fishermen of old today safely landed our party. What a Christ for rough weather! All the sailor boys ought to fly to him, as did those Galilean mariners. All you in the forecastle, and all you who run up and down the slippery ratlines, take to sea with you him who with a quiet word sent the winds back through the mountain gorges. Some of you Jack Tars, to whom these words will come, need to tack ship and change your course if you are going to get across this sea of life safely and gain the heavenly harbour. Belay there, ready about, helms a-lee, mainsail haul. You have too valuable a cargo on board to run into the Goodwins or the Skerries. Star of peace, beam over the billow, bless the soul that sighs for thee, bless the sailor's lonely pillow, far, far at sea. Here at Capernaum, the Arabs having in their arms carried us ashore to the only place where our Lord ever had a pastorate, and we stepped amid the ruins of the church where he preached again and again and again, the synagogue, whose rich sculpturing lay there, not as when others see it in springtime covered with weeds and loathsome with reptiles, but in that December weather completely uncovered to our agitated and intense gaze. On one stone of that synagogue is sculpturing of a pot of manna, an artistic commemoration of the time when the Israelites were fed by manna in the wilderness, and to which sculpturing no doubt Christ pointed upward while he was preaching that sermon on this very spot, in which he said, "Not as your fathers did eat manna and are dead, he that eateth of this bread shall live forever." Wonderful Capernaum, scene of more miracles than any place in all the earth. Blind eyes kindling with the morning, withered arms made to pulsate, lepers blooming into health, the dead girl reanimated. These Arab tents which on this December day I find in Palestine disappear, and I see Capernaum as it was when Jesus was pastor of the church here. Look at that wealthy home, the architecture, the marble front, the upholstery, the slaves in uniform at the doorway. It is the residence of a courtier of Herod, probably Chuza by name, his wife Joanna, a Christian disciple. But something is the matter. The slaves are in great excitement, and the courtier living there runs down the front steps and takes a horse and puts him at a full run across the country. The boy of that nobleman is dying of typhoid fever. All the doctors have failed to give relief. But about 5 miles up the country at Cana there is a divine doctor, Jesus by name, and the agonized father has gone for him, and with what earnestness those can understand who have had a dying child in the house. This courtier cries to Christ, "Come down, ere my child die." While the father is absent, and at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the people watching the dying boy see a change in the countenance, and Joanna, the mother, on one side of his couch, says, "Why, this darling is getting well. The fever has broken. See the perspiration on his forehead. Did any of you give him any new kind of medicine?" "No," is the answer. The boy turns on his pillow, his delirium gone, and asks for something to eat, and says, "Where's father?" "Oh, he has gone up to Cana to get a young doctor of about 31 years of age. But no doctor is needed now in this house at Capernaum. The people look at the sundial to find what time of day it is, and see it is just past noon and 1 o'clock. Then they start out and meet the returning father, and as soon as they come within speaking distance, they shout at the top of their voices, 'Your boy is getting well!' 'Is it possible?' says the father. 'When did the change for the better take place?' 1 o'clock, is the answer. 'Why,' says the courtier, 'that is just the hour that Jesus said to me, Thy son liveth, 1 o'clock.' As they gather at the evening meal, what gladness on all the countenances in that home at Capernaum. The mother Joanna has not had sleep for many nights, and she now falls off into delightful slumber. The father, Chuza, the Herodian courtier, worn out with anxiety, as well as by the rapid journey to and from Cana, is soon in restful unconsciousness. Joanna was a Christian before, but I warrant she was more of a Christian afterward. Did the father Chuza accept the Christ who had cured his boy? Is there in all the earth a parent so ungrateful for the convalescence or restoration of an imperilled child as not to go into a room and kneel down and make surrender to the almighty love that came to the rescue? Do not mix up this case with the angry discussions about Christian Science, but accept the doctrine, as old as the Bible, that God does answer prayer for the sick. That Capernaum boy was not the only illustration of the fact that prayer is mightier than a typhoid fever, and there is not a doctor of large practice but has come into the sick room of some hopeless case, and in a cheerful manner, if he were a Christian, or with a bewildered manner if he were a skeptic, said, "Well, what have you been doing with this patient? What have you been giving him? The pulse is better. The crisis is past. After all, I think he will get well." Prayer will yet be acknowledged in the world's materia medica, and the cry is just as appropriate now as when Chuza, the courtier from Capernaum, uttered in Christ's hearing, "Come down, ere my child die." If the prayer be not answered in the way we wish, it is because God has something better for the child than earthly recovery. And there are thousands of men and women now alive in answer to fathers' and mothers' prayers, myself one of the multitude. For I have heard my parents tell how, when at 3 years of age, scarlet fever seemed to have done its full work on me, and the physicians had said there was no more use of their coming, and they had left a few simple directions to make the remaining hours peaceful. And according to the custom in those times in country places, the neighbours had already come in and made the shroud. The forlorn case suddenly brightened, and the prayer, "Come down ere my child die," was answered, in a recovery that has not been followed by a moment's sickness from that time to this. The mightiest agency in the universe is prayer, and it turns even the Almighty. It decides the destinies of individuals, families, and nations. During our sad Civil War, a gentleman was a guest at the White House in Washington, and he gives this incident. He says, "I had been spending 3 weeks in the White House with Mr. Lincoln as his guest. One night, it was just after the Battle of Bull Run, I was restless and could not sleep. I was repeating the part which I was to take in a public performance. The hour was past midnight. Indeed, it was coming near to dawn when I heard low tones proceeding from a private room where the President slept. The door was partly open. I instinctively walked in, and there I saw a sight which I shall never forget. It was the President kneeling before an open Bible. The light was turned low in the room. His back was turned toward me. For a moment I was silent as I stood looking in amazement and wonder. Then he cried out in tones so pitiful and sorrowful, "O thou God that heard Solomon in the night when he prayed for wisdom, hear me. I cannot lead this people, I cannot guide the affairs of this nation without thy help. I am poor and weak and sinful. O God, who didst hear Solomon when he cried for wisdom, hear me and save the nation." You see, we don't need to go back to Bible times for evidence that prayer is heard and answered. But someone may say that Christ at Capernaum healed that courtier's child, yet he would not have done it for one in humble life. Why, in that very Capernaum he did the same thing for a dying slave, belonging to the man who had made a present to the town of the church of which Jesus was pastor, the synagogue among whose ruins I today leap from fragment to fragment. This was the cure of a Roman soldier's slave, whose only acknowledged rights were the wishes of his owner. And none are now so enslaved, or so humble, or so sick, or so sinful, but the all-sympathetic Christ is ready to help them, ready to cure them, ready to emancipate them. Hear it. Pardon for all, mercy for all, help for all, comfort for all, heaven for all. Oh, this Lake Galilee! What a refreshment for Christ it must have been after sympathizing with the sick and raising the dead and preaching to the multitudes all day long, to come down on these banks in the night time and feel the cool air of the sea on his hot face, and look up to the stars, the lighted lamps around the heavenly palaces from which he had descended. All heaven and earth were still, from the high post of stars to the hilled lake and mountain coast. All heaven and earth were still, though not in sleep, but breathless as we grow when feeling most. But, says someone, why was it that Christ, coming to save the world, should spend so much of his time on and around so solitary a place as Lake Galilee? There is only one city of any size on its beach, and both the western and eastern shores are a solitude broken only by the sounds coming from the mud hovels of the degraded. Why did not Christ begin at Babylon the mighty, at Athens the learned, at Cairo the historic, at Thebes the 100-gated, at Rome the triumphant? If Christ was going to save the world, why not go where the world's people dwelt? Would a man wishing to revolutionize for good the American continent pass his time amid the fishing huts on the shores of Newfoundland? My friends, Galilee was the hub of the wheel of civilization and art, and the centre of a population that staggers realization. On the shore of the lake we sail today stood 9 great cities: Scythopolis, Tariche, Hippos, Gamala, Chorazin, Capernaum, Bethsaida, Magdala, Tiberias, and many villages, the smallest of which had 15,000 inhabitants, according to Josephus, and reaching from the beach back into the country in all directions. Palaces, temples, colosseums, gymnasiums, amphitheatres, towers, gardens terraced on the hillsides, fountains bewildering with sunlight, baths upon whose mosaic floors kings trod. While this lake, from where the Jordan enters to where the Jordan leaves it, was beautiful with all styles of shallop, or dreadful with all kinds of war galleon. 4,000 ships, history says, were at one time upon these waters. Battles were fought there which shocked all nations with their consequences. Upon these sea fights looked Vespasian, and Titus, and Trajan, and whole empires. From one of these naval encounters, so many of the dead floated to the beach, they could not soon enough be entombed, and a plague was threatened. 1,200 soldiers escaping from these vessels of war were one day massacred in the amphitheatre at Tiberias. For 300 years, that almost continuous city encircling Lake Galilee was the metropolis of our planet. It was to the very heart of the world that Jesus came, to soothe its sorrows, and pardon its sins, and heal its sick, and emancipate its enslaved, and reanimate its dead. And let the Church and the world take the suggestion. While the solitary places are not to be neglected, we must strike for the great cities, if this world is ever to be taken for Christ. Evangelize all the earth except the cities, and in 1 year the cities would corrupt the earth. But bring the cities and all the world will come. Bring London and England will come. Bring Paris and France will come. Bring Berlin and Germany will come. Bring St. Petersburg and Russia will come. Bring Vienna and Austria will come. Bring Cairo and Egypt will come. Bring the near 3 million people in this cluster of cities on the Atlantic coast, and all America will soon see the salvation of God. Ministers of religion, let us intensify our evangelism. Editors and publishers, purify your printing presses. Asylums of mercy, enlarge your plans of endeavour. And instead of this absurd and belittling and wicked rivalry among our cities as to which happens to have the most men and women and children, not realizing that the most useless and bad people a city has, the worse it is off, and that a city which has 10,000 good people is more to be admired than a city with 100,000 bad people. Let us take a moral census and see how many good men and women are leading forth, how large a generation of good children who will consecrate themselves and consecrate the round world to holiness and to God. O thou blessed Christ, who didst come to the mighty cities encircling Lake Galilee, come in mercy to all our great cities today. Thou who didst put thy hand on the white mane of the foaming billows of Gennesaret, and make them lie down at thy feet, hush all the raging passions of the world. O thou blessed Christ, who on the night when the disciples were trying to cross this lake, and the wind was contrary, after 9 hours of rowing had made only 3 miles, didst come stepping on water that at the touch of thy foot hardened into crystal. Meet all our shipping, whether on placid or stormy seas, and say to all thy people now, by whatever style of tempest tossed or driven, as thou didst to the drenched disciples in the cyclone, be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. Thank God that I have seen this lake of Christly memories, and I can say with Robert McShane, the ascended minister of Scotland, who, seated on the banks of this lake, wrote in his last sick days, and just before he crossed the Jordan, not the Jordan that empties into Galilee, but the Jordan that empties into the sea of glass mingled with fire, these sweet words: fit to be played by human fingers on strung strings of earthly lute, or by angelic fingers on seraphic harps. It is not that the wild gazelle comes down to lap thy tide, but he that was pierced to save from hell oft wandered by thy side. Graceful around thee the mountains meet, thou calm, reposing sea, but far more the beautiful feet of Jesus walked o'er thee. O Saviour, gone to God's right hand, yet the same Saviour still, graved on thy heart is this lovely strand, and every fragrant hill. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of 25 Sermons on the Holy Land. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 25 Sermons on the Holy Land by Thomas DeWitt Talmage. On to Damascus. As he journeyed, he came near Damascus. Acts 9:8. In Palestine we spent last night in a mud hovel of 1 story, but camels and sheep in the basement. Yet never did the most brilliant hotel on any continent seem so attractive to me as that structure. If we had been obliged to stay in a tent, as we expected to do that night, we must have perished. A violent storm had opened upon us its volleys of hail and snow, and rain and wind, as if to let us know what the Bible means when prophet and evangelist and Christ himself spoke of the fury of the elements. The atmospheric wrath broke upon us about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and we were until night exposed to it. With hands and feet benumbed, and our bodies chilled to the bone, we made our slow way. While high upon the rocks, and the gale blowing the hardest, a signal of distress halted the party, for down in the ravines one of the horses had fallen, and his rider must not be left alone amid that wilderness of scenery and horror of storm. As the night approached, the tempest thickened and blackened and strengthened. Some of our attendants going ahead had gained permission for us to halt for the night in the mud hovel I speak of. Our first duty on arrival was the resuscitation of the exhausted of our party. My room was without a window, and an iron stove, without any top, in the center of the room, the smoke selecting my eyes in the absence of a chimney. Through an opening in the floor, Arab faces were several times thrust up to see how I was progressing. But the tempest ceased during the night, and before it was fully day we were feeling for the stirrups of our saddled horses, this being the day whose long march will bring us to that city whose name cannot be pronounced in the hearing of the intelligent or the Christian without making the blood to tingle and the nerves to thrill, and putting the best emotions of the soul into agitation. Damascus. During the day we passed Caesarea Philippi, the northern terminus of Christ's journeyings. North of that he never went. We lunch at noon, seated on the fallen columns of one of Herod's palaces. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, coming to a hilltop, we saw on the broad plain a city, which the most famous camel driver of all time afterward called Mohammed, the prophet and the founder of the most stupendous system of error that has ever cursed the earth, refused to enter because he said God would allow man to enter but one paradise, and he would not enter this earthly paradise lest he should be denied entrance to the heavenly. But no city that I ever saw so plays hide and seek with the traveler. The air is so clear the distant objects seem close by. You come on the top of a hill, and Damascus seems only a little way off. But down you go into a valley, and you see nothing for the next half hour but barrenness and rocks regurgitated by the volcanoes of other ages. Up another hill, and down again. Up again, and down again. But after your patience is almost exhausted, you reach the last hilltop, and the city of Damascus, the oldest city under the whole heavens and built by Noah's grandson, grows upon your vision. Every mile of the journey now becomes more solemn and suggestive and tremendous. This is the very road, for it has been the only road for thousands of years, the road from Jerusalem to Damascus, along which a cavalcade of mounted officers went about 1,854 years ago, in the midst of them a fierce little man, who made up by magnitude of hatred for Christianity for his diminutive stature, and was the leading spirit, and though suffering from chronic inflammation of the eyes, from those eyes flashed more indignation against Christ's followers than any one of the horsed procession. This little man, before his name was changed to Paul, was called Saul. So many of the mightiest natures of all ages are condensed into smallness of stature. The Frenchman who was sometimes called by his troops Old 100,000, was often, because of his abbreviated personal appearance, styled Little Nap. Lord Neilson, with insignificant stature to start with, and one eye put out at Calvi, and his right arm taken off at Teneriffe, proves himself at Trafalgar the mightiest hero of the English navy. The greatest of American theologians, Archibald Alexander, could stand under the elbow of many of his contemporaries. Look out for little men when they start out for some especial mission of good or evil. The thunderbolt is only a condensation of electricity. Well, that galloping group of horsemen on the road to Damascus were halted quicker than bombshell or cavalry charge ever halted a regiment. The Syrian noonday, because of the clarity of the atmosphere, is the brightest of all noondays, and the noonday sun in Syria is positively terrific for brilliance. But suddenly, that noon, there flashed from the heavens a light which made that Syrian sun seem tame as a star in comparison. It was the face of the slain and ascended Christ looking from the heavens, and under the dash of that overpowering light, all the horses dropped with their riders. Human face and horse's mane together in the dust. And then 2 claps of thunder followed, uttering the 2 words, the second word like the first, Saul, Saul. For 3 days that fallen equestrian was totally blind, for excessive light will sometimes extinguish the eyesight. And what cornea and crystalline lens could endure a brightness greater than the noonday Syrian sun? I had read it 100 times, but it never so impressed me before, and probably will never so impress me again, as I took my Bible from the saddlebags and read aloud to our comrades in travel. As he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven, and he fell to the earth, and heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And he said, Who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus whom thou persecutest. But we cannot stop longer on this road, for we shall see this unhorsed equestrian later in Damascus, toward which his horse's head is turned, and at which we must ourselves arrive before night. The evening is near at hand, and as we leave snowy Hermon behind us and approach the shadow of the cupolas of 200 mosques, we cut through a circumference of many miles of garden which embower the city. So luxuriant are these gardens, so opulent in colors, so luscious of fruits, so glittering with fountains, so rich with bowers and kiosks, that the Mohammedan's heaven was fashioned after what are to be seen here of bloom and fruitage. Here in Damascus, at the right season, are cherries and mulberries and apricots, and almonds and pistachios and pomegranates, and pears and apples and plums and citrons, and all the richness of the round world's pomology. No wonder that Julian called this city the Eye of the East, and that the poets of Syria have styled it the luster on the neck of doves, and historians said, It is the golden clasp which couples the 2 sides of the world together. Many travelers express disappointment with Damascus, but the trouble is, they have carried on their minds from boyhood the book which dazzles so many young people, the Arabian Nights, and they come into Damascus looking for Aladdin's lamp and Aladdin's ring, and the genii which appeared by rubbing them. But, as I have never read the Arabian Nights, such stuff not being allowed around our house in my boyhood, and nothing lighter in the way of reading than Baxter's Saints' Everlasting Rest, and D'Aubignay's History of the Reformation, Damascus appeared to me as sacred and secular history have presented it, and so the city was not a disappointment, but with few exceptions a surprise. Under my window tonight, in the hotel at Damascus, I hear the perpetual ripple and rush of the river Abana. Ah, the secret is out. Now I know why all this flora and fruit, and why everything is so green, and the plain one great emerald. The river Abana, and not far off the river Pharpar, which our horses waded through today. Thank the rivers, or rather the God who made the rivers. Deserts to the north, deserts to the south, deserts to the east, deserts to the west, but here a paradise. And, as the rivers Gihon and Pison, and Hiddekel, and Euphrates made the other paradise, Abana and Pharpar make this Damascus a paradise. That is what made General Naaman of this city of Damascus so mad when he was told for the cure of his leprosy to go and wash in the river Jordan. The river Jordan is much of the year a muddy stream, and it is never so clear as this river Abana that I hear rumbling under my window tonight, nor as the river Pharpar that we crossed today. They are as clear as though they had been sieved through some especial sieve of the mountains. General Naaman had great and patriotic pride in these two rivers of his own country, and when Elisha the prophet told him that if he wanted to get rid of his leprosy, he must go and wash in the Jordan, he felt as we who live on the magnificent Hudson would feel if told that we must go and wash in the muddy Thames, or as if those who live on the transparent Rhine were told that they must go and wash in the muddy Tiber. So General Naaman cried out with a voice as loud as ever he had used in commanding his troops, uttering those memorable words which every minister of the gospel sooner or later takes for his text. Are not Abana and Pharpar, rivers of Damascus, better than the waters of Israel? May I not wash in them and be clean? Thank God we live in a land with plenty of rivers, and that they bless all our Atlantic coast and all our Pacific coast, and reticulate all the continent between the coasts. Only those who have traveled in the deserts of Syria or Egypt, or have in the Oriental cities heard the tinkling of the bell of those who sell water, can realize what it is to have this divine beverage in abundance. Water rumbling over the rocks, turning the mill wheel, saturating the roots of the corn, dripping from the buckets, filling the pitchers of the household, rolling through the fonts of baptistries of holy ordinance, filling the reservoirs of cities, inviting the cattle to come down and slake their thirst, and the birds of heaven to dip their wing, ascending in robe of mist and falling again in benediction of shower. Water, living water, God-given water. We are awakened in the morning in Damascus by the song of those who have different styles of food to sell. It is not a street cry, as in London or New York, but a weird and long drawn-out solo, compared with which a buzz saw is musical. It makes you inopportunely awaken, and will not let you sleep again. But to those who understand the exact meaning of the song, it becomes quite tolerable, for they sing, God is the nourisher, buy my bread. God is the nourisher, buy my milk. God is the nourisher, buy my fruit. And as you look out of the window, you see the Mohammedans, who are in large majority in the city, at prayer. And if it were put to vote who should be king of all the earth, 15,000 in that city would say Christ, but 130,000 would say Mohammed. Looking from the window, you see on the housetops and in the streets Mohammedans at worship. The muezzin, or the officers of the religion, who announce the time of worship, appear high up on the different minarets or tall towers, and walk around the minaret, enclosed by a railing, and cry in a sad and mumbling way, "God is great. I bear witness that there is no God but God. I bear witness that Mohammed is the apostle of God. Come to the prayers, come to salvation. God is great. There is no other but God. Prayers are better than sleep." 5 times a day must the Mohammedan engage in worship. As he begins, he turns his face toward the city of Mecca, and unrolls upon the ground a rug which he almost always carries. With his thumbs touching the lobes of his ears, and holding his face between his hands, he cries, "God is great." Then, folding his hands across his girdle, he looks down and says, "Holiness to thee, O God, and praise be to thee. Great is thy name, great is thy greatness, there is no deity but thee." Then the worshipper sits upon his heels, then he touches his nose to the rug, and then his forehead, these genuflections accompanied with the cry, "Great is God." Then, raising the forefinger of his right hand toward heaven, he says, "I testify there is no deity but God, and I testify that Mohammed is the servant of God and the messenger of God." The prayers close by the worshipper holding his hands opened upward, as if to take the divine blessing, and then his hands are rubbed over his face, as if to convey the blessing to his entire body. There are 2 or 3 commendable things about Mohammedanism. One is that its disciples wash before every act of prayer, and that is 5 times a day, and there is a gospel in cleanliness. Another commendable thing is, they don't care who is looking, and nothing can stop them in their prayer. Another thing is that by the order of Mohammed, and an order obeyed for 1300 years, no Mohammedan touches strong drink. But the polygamy, the many wifehood of Mohammedanism has made that religion the unutterable and everlasting curse of woman, and when woman sinks, the race sinks. The proposition recently made in high ecclesiastical places for the reformation of Mohammedanism, instead of its obliteration, is like an attempt to improve a plague or educate a leprosy. There is only one thing that will ever reform Mohammedanism, and that is its extirpation from the face of the earth by the power of the gospel of the Son of God, which makes not only man but woman free for this life and free for the life to come. The spirit of the horrible religion which pervades the city of Damascus, along whose streets we walk, and out of whose bazaar we make purchases, and in whose mosques we study the wood carvings and bedizenments, was demonstrated as late as 1860, when in this city it put to death 6,000 Christians in 48 hours, and put to the torch 3,000 Christians' homes. And those streets we walk today were red with the carnage, and the shrieks and groans of the dying and dishonored men and women made this place a hell on earth. This went on until a Mohammedan, better than his religion, Abd el-Qadir by name, a great soldier who in one war had with 25,000 troops beaten 60,000 of the enemy, now protested against this massacre, and gathered the Christians of Damascus into castles and private houses, and filled his own home with the affrighted sufferers. After a while the mob came to his door and demanded the Christian dogs whom he was sheltering. And Abd el-Qadir mounted a horse and drew a sword, and, with a few of his old soldiers around him, charged on the mob and cried, "Wretches, is this the way you honor the prophet? May his curses be upon you! Shame on you! Shame! You will yet live to repent. You think you may do as you please with the Christians, but the day of retribution will come. The Franks will yet turn your mosques into churches. Not a Christian will I give up. They are my brothers. Stand back, or I will give my men the order to fire." Then by the might of one great soul under God, the wave of assassination rolled back. Huzzah for Ebd el-Kader! Although now we Americans and foreigners pass through the streets of Damascus unhindered, there is in many parts of the city the subdued hissing of a hatred for Christianity, that if it dared would put to death every man, woman, and child in Damascus who does not declare allegiance to Mohammed. But I am glad to say that a wide, hard, splendid turnpike road has within a few years been constructed from Beirut, on the shore of the Mediterranean, to this city of Damascus, and if ever again that wholesale assassination is attempted, French troops and English troops would, with jingling bits and lightning hoofs, dash up the hills and down on this Damascus plain, and leave the Mohammedan murderers dead on the floor of their mosques and seraglios. It is too late in the history of the world for governments to allow such things as the modern massacre at Damascus. For such murderous attacks on Christian missionaries and Christian disciples, the gospel is not so appropriate as bullets or sabres sharp and heavy enough to cut through with one stroke from crown of head to saddle. But I must say that this city of Damascus, as I see it now, is not as absorbing as the Damascus of olden times. I turn my back upon the bazaars, with rugs fascinating the merchants from Baghdad, and the Indian textile fabric of incomparable make, and the manufactured saddles and bridles gay enough for princes of the Orient to ride and pull, and baths where ablution becomes inspiration, and the homes of those bargain makers of today, marbled and divaned and fountained and upholstered and mosaicked and arabesqued and colonnaded until nothing can be added, and the splendid remains of the great Mosque of John, originally built with gates so heavy that it required 5 men to turn them, and columns of periphery and kneeling places framed in diamond, and 74 stained glass windows, and 600 lamps of pure gold, a single prayer offered in this mosque said to be worth 30,000 prayers offered in any other place. I turn my back on all these, and see Damascus as it was when this narrow street, which the Bible calls straight, was a great, wide street, a New York Broadway or a Parisian Champs-Élysées, a great thoroughfare crossing the city from gate to gate, along which tramped and rolled the pomp of all nations. There goes Abraham, the father of all the faithful. He has in this city been purchasing a celebrated slave. There goes Ben-Hadad of Bible times, leading 32 conquered monarchs. There goes David, king, warrior, and sacred poet. There goes Tamerlane the conqueror. There goes Harun al-Rashid, once the commander of an army of 95,000 Persians and Arabs. Here comes a warrior on his way to the barracks, carrying that kind of sword which the world has forgotten how to make, a Damascus blade with the interlacings of color changing at every new turn of the light, many colors coming and going and interjoining, the blade so keen it could cut in twain an object without making the lower part of the object tremble, with an elasticity that could not be broken, though you brought the point of the sword clear back to the hilt, and having a watered appearance which made the blade seem as though just dipped in a clear fountain, a triumph of cutlery which 1,000 modern foundrymen and chemists have attempted in vain to imitate. On the side of this street, damasks, named after this city, figures of animals and fruits and landscapes here being first wrought into silk, damasks, and specimens of damascening by which in this city steel and iron were first graved, and then the grooves filled with wire of gold, damascening. But stand back or be run over, for here are at the gates of the city laden caravans from Aleppo in one direction, and from Jerusalem in another direction, and caravans of all nations paying toll to this supremacy. Great is Damascus. But what most stirs my soul is neither chariot, nor caravan, nor bazaar, nor palace, but a blind man passing along the street, small of stature and insignificant in personal appearance. Oh, yes, we have seen him before. He was one of that cavalcade coming from Jerusalem to Damascus to kill Christians, and we saw him and his horse tumble up there on the road some distance out of the city, and he got up, blind. Yes, it is Saul of Tarsus now going along this street called Straight. He is led by his friends, for he cannot see his hand before his face, into the house of Judas. Not Judas the bad, but Judas the good. In another part of this city, one Ananias, not Ananias the liar, but Ananias the Christian, is told by the Lord to go to this house of Judas on Straight Street, and put his hands on the blind eyes of Saul, that his sight might return. "Oh," said Ananias, "I dare not go. That Saul is a terrible fellow. He kills Christians, and he will kill me." "Go," said the Lord, and Ananias went. There sits in blindness that tremendous persecutor. He was a great nature crushed. He had started for the city of Damascus for the one purpose of assassinating Christ's followers, but since that fall from his horse he has entirely changed. Ananias steps up to the sightless man, puts his right thumb on one eye and his left thumb on the other eye, and in an outburst of sympathy and love and faith says, "Brother Saul, brother Saul, the Lord, even Jesus that appeared unto thee in the way as thou camest, has sent me that thou mayest receive thy sight, and be filled with the Holy Ghost." Instantly something like scales fell from the blind man's eyes, and he arose from that seat the mightiest evangel of all the ages, a Sir William Hamilton for metaphysical analysis, a John Milton for sublimity of thought, a Whitefield for popular eloquence, a John Howard for widespread philanthropy, but more than all of them put together, inspired, thunderbolted, multipotent, apostolic. Did Judas, the kind host of this blind man, or Ananias, the visitor, see scales drop from the sightless eyes? I think not. But Paul knew they had fallen, and that is all that happens to any one of us when we are converted. The blinding scales drop from our eyes, and we see things differently. A Christian woman, missionary among a most degraded tribe whose religion was never to wash or improve personal appearance, was trying to persuade one of those heathen women not only of need of change of heart, but change of habits, which would result in change of appearance, but the effort failed until the missionary had placed in her own hallway a looking-glass, and when the barbaric woman, passing through the hall, saw herself in the mirror for the first time, she exclaimed, "Can it be possible I look like that?" And appalled at her own appearance, she renounced her own religion and asked to be instructed in the Christian religion. And so we feel that we are all right in our sinful and unchanged condition until the scales fall from our eyes, and in the looking-glass of God's Word we see ourselves as we really are, until divine grace transforms us. There are many people in this house today as blind as Paul was before Ananias touched his eyes, and there are many here from whose eyes the scales have already fallen. You see all subjects and all things differently, God and Christ and eternity and your own immortal spirit. Sometimes the scales do not all fall at once. When I was a boy, at Mount Pleasant, one Sunday afternoon, reading Doddridge's Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul, that afternoon some of the scales fell from my eyes, and I saw a little. After I had been in the ministry about a year, one Sunday afternoon in the village parsonage, reading the Bible story of the Syro-Phoenician's faith, other scales fell from my eyes, and I saw better. 2 Sunday evenings ago, while preparing for the evening service in New York, I picked up a book that I did not remember to have seen before, and after I had read a page about reconsecration to God, I think the remaining scales fell from my eyes. Shall not our visits to Damascus today result like Paul's visit, in vision to the blind, and increased vision for those who saw somewhat before? I was reading of a painter's child who became blind in infancy, but after the child was nearly grown, a surgeon removed the blindness. When told that this could be done, the child's chief thought, her mother being dead, was that she would be able to see her father, who had watched over her with great tenderness. When night came, she was in raptures, and ran her hands over her father's face, and shut her eyes as if to assure herself that this was really the father whom she had only known by touch. And now looking upon him, noble man as he was in appearance as well as in reality, she cried out, "Just to think that I had this father so many years and never knew him!" As great and greater is the soul's joyful surprise when the scales fall from the eyes and the long spiritual darkness is ended, and we look up into our Father's face, always radiant and loving, but now for the first revealed, and our blindness forever gone, we cry, "Abba, Father." To each one of this vast multitude of auditors I say, as Ananias did to Saul of Tarsus when his sympathetic fingers touched the closed eyelids, "Brother Saul, the Lord, even Jesus that appeared unto thee in the way that thou camest, has sent me that thou mightest receive thy sight and be filled with the Holy Ghost." End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25 of 25 Sermons on the Holy Land. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Glover. 25 Sermons on the Holy Land by Thomas DeWitt Talmage. Across Mount Lebanon. The cedars of Lebanon which he hath planted. Psalm 104:16. In our journey we change stirrup for wheel. It is 4 o'clock in the morning at Damascus, Syria, and we are among the lanterns of the hostelry waiting for the stage to start. A Mohammedan in high life is putting his 3 wives on board within an apartment by themselves, and our party occupy the main apartment of one of the most uncomfortable vehicles in which mortals were ever jammed and half strangulated. But we must not let the discomforts annul or disparage the opportunities. We are rolling on and out and up the mountains of Lebanon, their forehead under a crown of snow, which coronet the fingers of the hottest summer cannot cast down. We are ascending heights around which is garlanded much of the finest poesy of the Scriptures, and are rising toward the mightiest dominion that botany ever recognized, reigned over by the most imperial tree that ever swayed a leafy scepter, the Lebanon cedar, a tree eulogized in my text as having grown from a nut put into the ground by God himself, and no human hand had anything to do with its planting. The cedars of Lebanon, which he hath planted. The average height of this mountain is 7,000 feet, but in one place it lifts its head to an altitude of 10,000. No higher than 6,000 feet can vegetation exist, but below that line, at the right season, are vineyards and orchards, and olive groves, and flowers that dash the mountainside with a very carnage of color, and fill the air with aromatics that Hosea the prophet and Solomon the king celebrated as the smell of Lebanon. At a height of 6,000 feet is a grove of cedars, the only descendants of those vast forests from which Solomon cut his timber for the temple at Jerusalem, and where at one time there were 100,000 axemen hewing out the beams from which great cities were constructed. But this nation of trees has by human iconoclasm been massacred until only a small group is left. This race of giants is nearly extinct, but I have no doubt that some of these were here when Hiram, king of Tyre, ordered the assassination of those cedars of Lebanon which the Lord planted. From the multitude of uses to which it may be put, and the employment of it in the Scriptures, the cedar is the divine favorite. When the plains to be seen from the window of the stage in which we ride today are parched under summer heats, and not a grass blade survives the fervidity, this tree stands in luxuriance, defying the summer sun. And when the storms of winter terrify the earth, and hurl the rocks in avalanche down this mountainside, this tree grapples the hurricane of snow in triumph, and leaves the spent fury at its feet. From 60 to 80 feet high are they, the horizontal branches of great sweep, with their burden of leaves needle-shaped, the top of the tree pyramidal, a throne of foliage on which might and splendor and glory sit. But so continuously has the extermination of trees gone on, that for the most part the mountains of Lebanon are bare of foliage, while I am sorry to say the earth in all lands is being likewise denuded. The axe is slaying the forests all round the earth. To stop the slaughter, God opened the coal mines of England and Scotland and America and the world, practically saying by that, "Here is fuel. As far as possible, let my trees alone." And by opening for the human race the great quarries of granite and showing the human family how to make brick, God is practically saying, "Here is building material. Let my trees alone." We had better stop the axes among the Adirondacks. We had better stop the axes in all our forests, as it would have been better for Syria if the axes had long ago been stopped among the mountains of Lebanon. To punish us for our reckless assault on the forests, we have the disordered seasons. Now the droughts, because the uplifted arms of the trees do not pray for rain, their presence, according to all scientists, disposing the descent of the showers. And then we have the cyclones and the hurricanes, multiplied in number and velocity, because there is nothing to prevent their awful sweep. Plant the trees in your parks, that the weary may rest under them. Plant them along your streets, that up through the branches passers-by may see the God who first made the trees, and then made man to look at them. Plant them along the brooks, that under them children may play. Plant them in your gardens, that as in Eden the Lord may walk there in the cool of the day. Plant them in cemeteries, their shade like a mourner's veil, and their leaves sounding like the rustle of the wings of the departed. Let Arbor Day, or the day for the planting of trees, recognized by the legislatures of many of the states, be observed by all our people, and the next 100 years do as much in planting these leafy glories of God as the last 100 years have accomplished in their destruction. When, not long before his death, I saw on the banks of the Hudson, in his glazed cap, riding on horseback, George P. Morris, the great songwriter of America, I found him grandly emotional, and I could understand how he wrote, "Woodman, spare that tree," the verses of which many of us have felt like quoting in belligerent spirit, when under the stroke of someone without sense or reason we saw a beautiful tree prostrated. Woodman, spare that tree. Touch not a single bough. In youth it sheltered me, and I'll protect it now. 'Twas my forefather's hand that placed it near his cot. There, woodman, let it stand. Thy axe shall harm it not. My heartstrings round thee cling, close as thy bark, old friend. Here shall the wild bird sing, and still thy branches bend. Old tree, the storm's still brave, and woodman, leave the spot, while I've a hand to save. Thy axe shall harm it not. As we ride along on these mountains of Lebanon, we bethink how its cedars spread their branches, and breathe their aroma, and cast their shadows all through the Bible. Solomon discoursed about them in his botanical works, when he spoke of trees, from the cedar tree that is in Lebanon, even unto the hyssop that springeth out of the wall. The psalmist says, "The righteous shall grow like a cedar in Lebanon," and in one of his magnificent doxologies calls on the cedars to praise the Lord. And Solomon says the countenance of Christ is excellent as the cedars, and Isaiah declares, "The day of the Lord shall be upon all the cedars of Lebanon." And Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Amos and Zephaniah and Zechariah weave its foliage into their sublimest utterances. As we ride over Lebanon today, there is a howling wind sweeping past and a dash of rain, all the better enabling us to appreciate that description of a tempest, which no doubt was suggested by what David had seen with his own eyes among these heights. For as a soldier he carried his wars clear up to Damascus, and such a poet as he, I warrant, spent many a day on Lebanon, and perhaps while he was seated on this very rock against which our carriage jolts, he writes that wonderful description of a thunderstorm. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty. The voice of the Lord breaketh the cedars of Lebanon. Yea, the Lord breaketh the cedars of Lebanon. He maketh them also to skip like a calf, Lebanon and Syrian, like a young unicorn. The voice of the Lord divideth the flames of fire. As the lion is the monarch of the fields, and Behemoth the monarch of the waters, the cedar is the monarch of the trees. And I think one reason why it is so glorified all up and down the Bible is because we need more of its characteristics in our religious life. We have too much of the willow, and are easily bent this way or that, too much of the aspen, and we tremble under every zephyr of assault, too much of the bramble tree, and our sharp points sting and wound, but not enough of the cedar, wide-branched and heaven-aspiring and tempest-grappling. But the reason these cedars stand so well is that they are deep-rooted. They run their anchors down into the caverns of the mountain, and fasten to the very foundations of the earth, and twist around and clinch themselves on the other side of the deepest layer of rock they can reach. And that is the difference between Christians who stand and Christians who fall. It is the difference between a superficial character and one that has clutched its roots deep down, around and under the rock of ages. One of the Lebanon cedars was examined by a scientist, and from its concentric circles it was found to be 3,500 years old, and still standing. And there is such a thing as everlasting strength, and such a staunchness of Christian character, that all time and all eternity, instead of being its demolition, shall be its opportunity. Not such are those vacillating Christians, who are so pious on Sunday that they have no religion left for the weekday. As the anaconda gorges itself with food, and then seems for a long while to lie thoroughly insensible, so there are men who will on Sunday get such a religious surfeit that the rest of the week they seem thoroughly dead to all religious emotion. They weep in church under a charity sermon, but if on Monday a subject of want presents itself at the door, the beggar's safety will depend entirely on quick limbs and an unobstructed stairway. It takes all the grace they can get to keep them from committing assault and battery on those intruders who come with pale faces and stories of distress and subscription papers. The reason that God planted these cedars in the Bible was to suggest to us that we ought, in our religious character, to be deep like the cedar, high like the cedar, broad-branched as the cedar. A traveler measured the spread of the boughs of one of these trees and found it 111 feet from branch tip to branch tip. And I have seen cedars of Christian character that through their prayers and charities put out one branch to the uttermost parts of America, and another branch to the uttermost parts of Asia. And these wide-branched Christians will keep on multiplying until all the earth is overshadowed with mercy. But mark you, these cedars of Lebanon could not grow if planted in mild climates and soft air, and in carefully watered gardens. They must have the gymnasium of the midnight hurricane to develop their arms. They must play the athlete with 1,000 winters before their feet are rightly planted, and their foreheads rightly lifted, and their arms rightly muscled. And if there be any other way for developing strong Christian character except by storms of trouble, I never heard of it. Call the roll of martyrs, call the roll of the prophets, call the roll of the apostles, and see which of them had an easy time of it. Which of these cedars grew in the warm valley? Not one of them. Honeysuckles thrive best on the south side of the house, but cedars in a Syrian whirlwind. Men and women who hear this or read this, instead of your grumbling because you have it hard, thank God that you are in just the best school for making heroes and heroines. It is true both for this world and the next. Rock that baby in a cradle, cushioned and canopied. Graduate him from that into a costly high chair, and give him a gold spoon. Send him to school wrapped in furs enough for an Arctic explorer. Send him through a college where he will not have to study in order to get a diploma, because his father is rich. Start him in a profession where he begins with an office, the floor covered with Axminster, and a library of books in Russian Morocco, and an armchair upholstered like a throne, and an embroidered ottoman upon which to put his $12 gaiters, and then lay upon his table the best ivory cigar holder you can import from Brussels, and have standing outside his door a prancing span that won the prize at the horse fair, and leave him estate enough to make him independent of all struggle. And what will become of him? If he do not die early of inanition or dissipation, he will live a useless life and die an unlamented death and go into a fool's eternity. But what has been the history of most of the great cedars in merchandise, in art, in law, in medicine, in statesmanship, in Christian usefulness? John, get up and milk the cows. It's late. It's 5:30 in the morning. Split an armful of wood on your way out so that we can build the fires for breakfast. Put your bare feet on the cold oilcloth, and break the ice in your pitcher before you can wash. Yes, it has been snowing and drifting again last night, and we will have to break the roads. The boys' educational advantages, a long oak plank without any back to it, in country schoolhouse, and stove throwing out more smoke than heat, pressing on from one hardship to another. After a while, a position on salary or wages small enough to keep life, but keep it at its lowest ebb. Starting in occupation or business with prosperous men, trying to fight you back at every step, but after a good while fairly on your feet, and your opportunities widening, and then by some sudden turn you are triumphant. You are master of the situation, and defiant of all earth and hell, a Lebanon cedar. John Milton, on his way up to the throne of the world's sacred poesy, must sell his copyright of Paradise Lost for $72 in 3 payments. And William Shakespeare, on his way up to be acknowledged the greatest dramatist of all ages, must hold horses at the door of the London Theatre for a 6pence, and Homer must struggle through total blindness to immortality. And John Bunyan must cheer himself on the way up by making a flute out of his prison stool, and Canova, the sculptor, must toil on through orphanage, modeling a lion in butter before he could cut his statues in marble. And the great Stevenson must watch cows in the field for a few pennies, and then become a stoker, and afterward mend clocks before he puts the locomotive on its track, and calls forth plaudits from parliaments and medals from kings. Abel Stevens is picked up a neglected child of the street, and rises through his consecrated genius to be one of the most illustrious clergymen and historians of the century. And Bishop Janes of the same church in boyhood worked his passage from Ireland to America, and up to a usefulness where, in the bishopric, he was second to no one who ever adorned it. While in banishment, Xenophon wrote his Anabasis and Thucydides, his history of the Peloponnesian War, and Victor Hugo must be exiled for many years to the island of Guernsey before he can come to that height in the affections of his countrymen that crowds Champs-Élysées and the adjoining boulevards with 1,000,000 mourners, as his hearse rolls down to the Church of the Madeleine. Oh, it is a tough old world, and it will keep you back and keep you down, and keep you under as long as it can. Hail, sons and daughters of the fire! Stand, as the anvil when the stroke of stalwart men falls fierce and fast. Storms but more deeply root the oak whose brawny arms embrace the blast. Stand like an anvil. Noise and heat are born of earth and die with time. The soul, like God, its source and seat, is solemn, still, serene, sublime. 30 years from now, the foremost men in all occupations and professions will be those who are this hour in awful struggle of early life, many of them without $5 to their name. So in spiritual life, it takes a course of bereavements, persecutions, sicknesses, and losses to develop stalwart Christian character. I got a letter a few days ago saying, "I have hardly seen a well day since I was born, and I could not write my own name until I was 50 years of age, and I am very poor, but I am, by the grace of God, the happiest man in Chicago." The Bible speaks of the snows of Lebanon, and at this season of the year, the snows there must be tremendous. The deepest snow ever seen in America would be insignificant compared with the mildest winter of snows on those Lebanon mountains. The cedars catch that skyful of crystals on their brow and on their long arms. Piled up in great hefts are those snows, enough to crush other trees to the ground, splitting the branches from the trunk, and leaving them rent and torn, never to rise. But what did the cedars care for these snows on Lebanon? They look up to the winter skies and say, "Snow on, empty the white heavens upon us, and when this storm is past, let other processions of tempests try to bury us in their fury. We have for 500 winters been accustomed to this, and for the next 500 winters we will cheerfully take all you have to send, for that is the way we develop our strength, and that is the way we serve God, and teach all ages how to endure and conquer. So I say, good cheer to all people who are snowed under. Put your faith in God, and you will come out gloriously. Others may be stunted growths, or weak junipers on the lower levels of spirituality, but you are going to be Lebanon cedars, At last it will be said of such as you, These are they who came out of great tribulations, and had their robes washed and made white in the blood of the Lamb. But while crossing over these mountains of Lebanon, I bethink myself of what an exciting scene it must be when one of the cedars does fall. It does not go down like other trees, with a slight crackle that hardly makes the woodsman look up, or a hawk flutter from a neighboring bough. When a cedar falls, it is the great event in the calendar of the mountains. The axemen fly, the wild beasts slink to their dens, the partridges swoop to the valley for escape. The neighboring trees go down under the awful weight of the descending monarch. The rocks are moved out of their places, and the earth trembles, as from miles around all ravines send back their sympathetic echoes. Crash, crash, crash. So when the great cedars of worldly or Christian influence fall, it is something terrific. Within the past few years, how many mighty and overtopping men have gone down? There seems now to be an epidemic of moral disaster. The moral world, the religious world, the political world, the commercial world are quaking with the fall of Lebanon cedars. It is awful. We are compelled to cry out with Zechariah the prophet, Howl, fir trees, for the cedar is fallen. Some of the smaller trees are glad of it. When some great dealer in stocks goes down, the small dealers clap their hands and say, Good for him. When a great political leader goes down, the small politicians clap their hands and say, Just as I expected. When a great minister of religion falls, many little ministers laugh up their sleeves and think themselves somehow advantaged. Ah, beloved brethren, no one makes anything out of moral shipwreck. Not a willow by the rivers of Damascus, not a sycamore on the plains of Jericho, not an olive tree in all Palestine is helped by the fall of a Lebanon cedar. Better weep and pray and listen to Paul's advice to the Galatians when he says, Consider thyself, lest thou also be tempted. No man is safe until he is dead, unless he be divinely protected. A greater thinker than Lord Francis Bacon the world never saw, and he changed the world's mode of thinking for all time. His Novum Organum, a miracle of literature, with $38,000 salary and estates worth millions, and from the highest judicial bench of the world, he goes down under the power of bribery, and confessed his crime, and was sentenced to the tower and the scorn of centuries. Howl, fir tree, for the cedar is fallen. Warren Hastings, rising until he became Governor-General of India, and the envy of the chief public men of his day, plunges into cruelties against the barbaric people he had been sent to rule, until his name is chiefly associated with the criminal trial in Westminster Hall, where upon him came the anathemas of Sheridan, Fox, Edmund Burke, the English nation, and all time. Howl, fir tree, for the cedar is fallen. As eminent instances of moral disaster are found in our own land and our own time, instances that I do not recite lest I wound the feelings of those now alive to mourn the shipwreck, let your indignation against the fallen turn to pity. A judge in one of our American courts gives this experience. In a respectable but poor family, a daughter was getting a musical education. She needed one more course of lessons to complete that education. The father's means were exhausted, and so great was his anxiety to help his daughter, that he feloniously took some money from his employer, and going home to his daughter said, There is the money to complete your musical education. The wife and mother suspected something wrong, and obtained from her husband the whole story, and that night went around with her husband to the merchant's house, and surrendered the whole amount of the money, and asked forgiveness. Forgiveness was denied, and the man was arrested. The judge, knowing all the circumstances, and that the money had all been returned, suggested to the merchant he had better let the matter drop, for the sake of the wife and daughter. No, he would not let it drop, and he did all he could to make the case conspicuous and blasting. The judge says that afterward the same inexorable merchant was before him for breaking the law of the land. It is a poor rule that will not work both ways. Let him that standeth take heed, lest he fall. Not congratulation, but tears, when a cedar is fallen. The end. End of chapter 25. End of 25 Sermons on the Holy Land by Thomas DeWitt Talmage.